Chapter 2083. What appeared in front of Luofan was a village. It wasn't a big village, with only 100 or so households. It was a small village that would look ordinary in any world, and it wouldn't be surprising if it appeared anywhere. The smoke he saw from afar came from a huge chimney at the center of the village. Such a village, which would look ordinary anywhere, appeared in front of him at this moment. Luofan couldn't believe his eyes. The village looked extremely ordinary. There were old people and children chatting leisurely, playing and fooling around. There were also strong men and women busy with farming. Around the village, there were large tracts of fertile farmland that had been reclaimed. All kinds of crops were planted on them. There were even poultry and pets running around. Such a scene, if placed in any world, would be so ordinary. But in this world, it was strange no matter how he looked at it. It should be noted that every grain of sand, every stone, every blade of grass, every leaf had its own heaven and earth, a heaven and earth with its own world. No matter how one looked at it, ordinary should be isolated from this world. Yet, under such circumstances, right in front of him, a scene that looked so ordinary and normal had appeared in front of him 100 years ago. How could he not be surprised? At that moment, Luofan did not hesitate and unhurriedly walked toward the village. If he wanted to understand the situation in this world, he had to come into contact with the living beings in this world. Whether they were natives or cultivators, although the village was small, it was also divided into various functions. At the entrance of the village, there were also people guarding it. Soon, they noticed Luofan's appearance. Immediately, a strong man appeared at the intersection, blocked in front of Luofan, and said, "This is a fellow villager. This is a fellow from the same hometown. Who are you looking for in our village?" Luofan sized up the strong man. He didn't have any extraordinary senses at the moment, so he could see completely different things from close to and from far away. Just now, he only had a rough look from afar, but he couldn't see through these people. Now that he was closer, he could finally see some clues. Each of them also had a world within their bodies. Furthermore, it was not just a single world, but an unknown number of worlds. Compared to a cultivator like Luofan, who had gone through countless tempering for countless trillions of years, that structure was incomparable to that of a cultivator. Naturally, it was much cruder. However, in terms of level, he should have reached the level of a first tribulation expert. Such an existence would not be able to display any extraordinary power even in this world. However, he should be able to be self-sufficient from the inside. Not to mention anything else, eating, drinking, and taking a dump in the mortal world could not be avoided. However, according to the village they formed, there was still smoke and crops. Judging from their rations, it was obvious that they were not self-sufficient. They still needed to constantly absorb materials and energy from the outside world to maintain their own survival. This situation was just like begging with a golden rice bowl. Luofan couldn't figure out why it was like this. But now, after looking at the muscular man up close, he had completely figured it out. This was because they were born with this structure. It was completely out of their control, and it was even to the extent that they couldn't sense it. It was exactly because of this that they were born with unbelievable strength. Even if they were in this world, they could live well like mortals, and they didn't have to worry at all. Even a rock in this world weighed trillions of kilograms, however. It was exactly because of this that they didn't cultivate at all. If one wanted to be self-sufficient and not rely on external forces, then the most basic requirement was to attain the first heaven golden immortal realm. Only by attaining the first heaven golden immortal realm and being able to establish a world and create living beings would one be able to produce sufficient energy within one's body to satisfy all one's needs and attain self-sufficiency without relying on external forces. Without such a realm, it was impossible for one to be self-sufficient even if one possessed strength that could destroy the world. Just like the living beings that were born in this world, Even though the strength they possessed was sufficient to crush countless first heaven golden immortal realm cultivators, they were unable to attain self-sufficiency and not rely on external forces like first heaven golden immortal realm cultivators were capable of. In their opinion, their strength was constantly counteracting the pressure of this world and the corrosion of this world towards them, and it was utilized to maintain the normal circulation of this body. The consumption of energy at every single moment caused them to have to consume food every once in a while in order to maintain their bodies from collapsing. What a pity! When he figured out all of this, Luo Fan couldn't help but sigh in his heart. This brawny man had grasped such terrifying power, but he couldn't even break free from the restriction of food. This was simply a reckless waste of resources. Moreover, because of their innate nature, it would be thousands of times more difficult for them to break free from this restriction in the future compared to ordinary living beings. After all, because of the environment they lived in, their senses towards energy had become dull to the point that even the living beings with the lowest natural endowments and the least intelligence surpassed them by thousands of times. If they were sensitive, then they would naturally be living in fear of this world at all times. How could they have survived until now? There was no need to mention exactly how difficult it was to advance one's cultivation to the first heaven golden immortal realm with such a slow reaction. It could be said that unless their natural endowments were heaven-defying, it was simply impossible for them to succeed. To possess such formidable strength, yet be completely cut off from cultivation, and even have no hope of transcending it, such an encounter was tragic no matter how one looked at it. Of course, such thoughts were only circulating in Luo Fan's mind. It was impossible for him to show it directly. At this moment, he simply found a few excuses and managed to convince the robust man. He accepted him to settle down in the village. As for what excuses he found, there was no need to elaborate. With Luo Fan's experience that spanned billions of trillions of years and millions of worlds, it would only take a few hours for him to become the master of this village and make everyone in it his slaves, let alone settle down. Settling down in this village was Luo Fan's whim. It was a thought that came to him after he saw the village. As for the reason, it was naturally very simple. He came to this world. Everything was unfamiliar. Did it not matter where he stayed? Did it matter where he stayed? It made no difference to him whether he chose this village or any other place. If that was the case, then why waste time choosing other places? Wouldn't it be better to just settle down in this village? In any case, with the cultivation environment of this world, this place alone was enough to support his cultivation, allowing him to obtain a cultivation environment that was more perfect than the second level of the road of Tao Master. Integrating into this village. It was not difficult for Luo Fan at all. In just a few days, everyone in this village already felt that he was no different from a native of this village, and truly accepted him as a part of this village. At this point, Luo Fan began to take action. First, he transformed his understanding of this world into a set of external martial arts, and taught it to the robust men in this village, so that they would work hard to cultivate in order to obtain extraordinary power and improve their strength. Those strong men were overjoyed to receive this kind of teaching. Their village was just a remote village, although they heard that there was an inheritance of extraordinary power in the big cities. But they had never seen it. Now that they had received the inheritance, how could they not cultivate without eating or sleeping? Luo Fan's understanding of cultivation had already reached a level that ordinary practitioners could not imagine. Based on his understanding of this world, the cultivation method of extraordinary power was naturally extremely perfect. Because of his own limited understanding of this world, and his lack of understanding of the extraordinary rules of this world, the efficiency of the extraordinary power cultivation was not too high. The extraordinary power that he cultivated was not too strong. But there was absolutely no problem with the cultivation method. It was a cultivation method that could definitely cultivate extraordinary power. Therefore, in just 3 months, everyone in the village, regardless of whether they were men or women, young or old, had cultivated transcendent powers. Of course, among them, the strongest was actually equivalent to a third-rate warrior in the ordinary world. In the eyes of ordinary people, they were already unparalleled, but in the eyes of real experts, they were the kind that could kill dozens of people with one finger. The villagers had benefited and their strength had greatly improved, but Luo Fan's efforts were not in vain. Apart from the villagers' reverence for him, he also had a deeper understanding of the extraordinary rules of this world through the cultivation of the indigenous people's extraordinary power. In just a few months, he had already created a cultivation method that was rooted in the worldview from nothing, a cultivation method that was different from external martial arts and had evolved into an internal martial arts cultivation method. Moreover, as time passed, and as his understanding of the extraordinary rules deepened, the internal martial arts within it continued to sublimate and improve, evolving towards the ultimate immortal cultivation method. To him, this was only a matter of time. On this day, Luo Fan was sitting cross-legged in front of the stone house he built, and was cultivating the internal martial arts with his eyes closed. The strength of this world itself had already surpassed any world that Luo Fan had seen in the past, including all the worlds he had seen. In such a world, if he wanted to use any extraordinary power, the effect needed to be more than 1,000,000,000,000 times greater than any extraordinary power he had used in any world he had been in before. In other words, even ordinary external martial arts would only be able to exert the effect of extraordinary power when it reached a level that was even comparable to the cultivation path of a false sage. As for internal martial arts, it would only be effective when one had reached the level of a calamity stage powerhouse. At this moment, when Luo Fan was cultivating the internal martial arts, it began to naturally open up a world inside his body. With the countless worlds piled up and arranged in his body, an indescribable meridian system was constructed all over his body. Wisps of powerful power were continuously derived from the meridians formed by these worlds, and they kept converging. They kept increasing, and eventually turned into a surging torrent. They flowed up and down his body endlessly. These worlds that he had opened up were quite similar in level to the worlds that existed inside any matter in the outside world. Of course, it was only similar. If he wanted to really reach that level, even he could not do it, don't forget. That was a world that was almost perfect, that kind of world. Back then, when he opened up a world, he needed to use the power of the chaotic state to undergo the great calamity of the world again and again to be able to open it up. Now, even if it had increased by countless times, it was still impossible to open up millions of worlds in his body at will. However, although the level was different from the worlds that existed in the outside world, those worlds also had a characteristic that was far superior to the worlds that existed in the outside world. That was, these worlds were completely opened up according to the world view of the laws. In other words, these worlds were already inseparable from Luo Fan the moment they were opened up. Not only was he able to control them as he pleased, but the order was even tighter than everything else. Moreover, that order was so tight that it surpassed everything else. Even the order of heaven and earth that the villagers had was far from being able to compare to this power. Given the environment of this world and the laws, with such an order, the improvement of these worlds was obviously only a matter of time. Therefore, although these worlds were not comparable to the worlds inside the outside world, that was only temporary. With the passage of time, one day these worlds would eventually reach the level of the outside world. In fact, if he thought of some other means, it was not impossible for him to make them surpass the outside world. At this moment, Luo Fan finally completed the opening of the last world and finally established the entire meridian system. With the complete establishment of the meridian system, the power inside the meridian began to be born at a speed that was 100 times faster than before. In the blink of an eye, it filled every inch of the void in his meridian. The power did not stop being born at this time. Instead, it continued to be born and accumulated in his meridian system. It constantly squeezed the meridian system and began to form a strong impact on the meridian system that had just been formed. Creaking sounds came from the meridian system as if it was going to completely collapse in the next moment. In the face of such changes, Luo Fan's expression did not change at all. Instead, he began to push the power in his body according to the technique he had experimented over the past few days and began to circulate according to an extremely mysterious path. Under his arduous pushing, the power that was originally chaotic and derived began to become orderly, and in the process of circulating, it began to transform continuously. Its quality was constantly improving, and its essence was constantly sublimating. Finally, after a total of 129,600 cycles, the power finally completed some kind of inexplicable sublimation, and a wisp of indescribable mysterious power was born from it. Although this wisp of power was created by Luo Fan, even he could not fully understand all the properties of this wisp of power. He only knew that this power could form an inexplicable connection with the outside world. This seems strange, but in fact it could not be more natural. After all, one should not forget the reason why he had opened the extraordinary door. He had opened the extraordinary door by relying on his own actions to trigger some kind of change in the world. In other words, he had opened the extraordinary door by relying on the power of the world itself. Under such circumstances, the transcendent system derived from the door of transcendence was naturally rooted in the world where he was. In other words, it was the third level of the Tao Master's path. In this way, the power derived from the extraordinary power would be beyond his imagination, and its nature would be so profound that he could not fully grasp it. What was so strange about that? On the contrary, it would be strange if he could fully understand this wisp of power and completely grasp all its properties. After this wisp of power appeared, it began to crazily swallow all the power in his meridian system of heaven and earth, and began to grow bit by bit. In the end, when all the power was swallowed, this wisp of power had grown to the size of a thumb. It began to flow along his meridian system of heaven and earth, gradually refining the meridian system, or in other words, refining the world that made up the meridian system. As this power circulated and refined, the world within the meridian system began to tremble slightly. The rules and principles within the world seemed to be undergoing repeated cleansing, and were gradually strengthening. The strength of the world itself also gradually increased during this process. In the end, after another 129,600 cycles, this power changed direction and rushed toward the top of the meridian system of heaven and earth, which was the position corresponding to the top of Luo Fan's head. Crack, 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 earth-shattering roars came from the top of Luo Fan's head at this moment, as if there were giant thunders exploding inside his head. The sound shook the matter around Luo Fan's body, causing it to tremble and jump continuously. It should be known that every matter in this world had its own existence and existence within it. The weight of such an existence was indescribable. Chapter 2084. The top of Luo Fan's head started to throb amidst the roars that could destroy a perfect world. In the end, after 129,600 beats, all the sounds turned into a sharp cry that rushed out of his head. Following this long roar, a colorless stream of air broke through the top of his head and soared into the sky, fusing with the surrounding void. Immediately after, an endless stream of air began to gather at the top of his head from all directions. It began to rush into the top of his head and quickly converged into the heaven and earth meridian system that had just been established in his body. With an unimaginable speed, it began to refine the heaven and earth meridian that formed the heaven and earth meridian, as well as the strands of power that were born from the heaven and earth. It raised the quality and level of the power in an extraordinary manner. In just a few breaths, the power had completed an indescribable sublimation, and its quality had increased by at least 10 times. At this time, Luo Fan's strength had increased by at least 100 times compared to his original strength. As expected, this method is correct. At this moment, this thought flashed through Luo Fan's mind. At this moment, endless information was continuously transmitted into his mind through the stream of air that surged into his body. This information was extremely messy, and it was a description of the various states of the world. Through this information, as long as he organized it slightly, he would naturally be able to understand the mysteries of the laws of the world. Unfortunately, even though the information was pouring in endlessly, it only lasted for a single breath. In the blink of an eye, all the information disappeared without a trace, just as it had appeared. What a pity! I've only opened the bridge between the heavens and the earth. In the end, I still can't fully comprehend the laws of the world. At this moment, Luo Fan could not help but sigh. The change that had happened to his body just now was nothing else. It was the same as when ordinary living beings cultivated martial arts. He had opened the barrier between the inside and outside of his body, connecting the inner and outer world. In other words, the legendary opening the bridge between the heavens and the earth. This process had a name in martial arts, and that was to reverse postnatal and become innate. Normally, any living creature that reached this step would be able to break through the limits of the human body, communicate with heaven and earth, and absorb the nutrients and energy needed for their transformation. This could also be considered the true beginning of transcendence. In this world where there was an almost perfect world in any matter. Although this process was similar to a martial artist achieving the Xiantian realm, the level of transformation was not comparable to an ordinary martial artist achieving the Xiantian realm. It was comparable to an ordinary cultivator achieving the false sage realm. Compared to becoming a supreme emperor, it was thousands of times stronger. It could be said that after he'd opened the bridge between the heavens and the earth and formed a stable channel of communication with the heavens and the earth, he could be considered to have regained the ability to comprehend the laws of the heavens and the earth, and even the ability to break through the restrictions of the laws of the heavens and the earth. Of course, this could also be considered as breaking the greatest restriction he had ever faced after stepping into this world. From then on, he could be considered to have soared into the sky, and he was no longer the same as before, although the information that poured in from the heavens and the earth was extremely messy and the time was extremely short. Just this harvest alone was enough for Luo Fan to recognize many of the blurry facts that he'd seen before. At this moment, he did not even need to use the extraordinary power that he had just condensed, which was the innate true qi of this world. Just by analyzing the information that the other party had just given him, he already possessed all sorts of unimaginable abilities. At this moment, his body floated in the air. As it trembled slightly in midair, it had already turned into thousands of figures. With another flash, flames soared into the sky, followed by flashes of lightning, followed by the appearance of ice. He could even teleport and travel through time. These abilities also appeared on his body at the same time. Compared to his true strength, these abilities were naturally inferior by trillions of times. However, in this world, these abilities had already surpassed his previous abilities by countless times. It could be said that the current him was still very far from being invincible in this world, but he already had enough power to protect himself. At the very least, it shouldn't be a big problem for him to go to any place in this world. Luo Fan's closed-door cultivation took a total of 3 years. After such a long time, how could the villagers in the village not understand that this villager who'd recently joined them was an unbelievably powerful expert? At this moment, there were already dozens of men and women, young and old, surrounding him in the distance. As they looked from afar, there was excitement, anticipation, and even faint fear. Moreover, such a powerful existence could definitely kill all the hundreds of families in the village within a few minutes if he wanted to. If he was more ruthless, he could even completely wipe out all traces of the entire village. How could such a powerful expert not interest the villagers? Did they not want to learn such a powerful technique from him? How could they not feel fear towards his existence? With the information just now, the current Luo fan could no longer only rely on his own eyes to observe and comprehend. At this moment, his perception had already recovered a little. Of course, it was not appropriate to say that it had recovered. Originally, his perception had not been damaged at all. It was just that its power could not be reflected in this world, as if it did not exist. But now, the perception he had obtained was a new one. It was a perception derived from the extraordinary power in this world. The strength of this perception was far inferior to his own perception. But in this world, or in other words, in the third level of the road to Tao Master, it could exert an effect that was far beyond imagination. With just a sweep of his perception, everything within a radius of hundreds of miles was included in his mind. Not only the terrain, the ground, but also the perfect world contained in all the substances were directly sensed by him at this time. It was endless. The moment the almost perfect world was included in his perception, Luo Fan seemed to have turned into a shocking giant and appeared in a vast and boundless starry sky. At a glance, everywhere was like a world of stars. That vast and infinite appearance, even he could not help but feel a kind of indescribable shock at this moment. As expected of the third level, he murmured, gradually withdrawing his perception and opening his eyes again. As for those villagers, he could easily send them away. At this time, it only took a few words, but it had already calmed the uneasiness in the hearts of the villagers, so that they almost did not care about the terrifying level of power that he had shown. In the next few days, Luo Fan did not leave the village. Instead, he still stayed in the house specially built for him in the village to meditate and comprehend the Dharma of this world. He reorganized the extraordinary power that he had opened up and could cultivate in this world. On this day, when he was cultivating, he suddenly sensed that there was something in the distance that was quickly approaching the village. Looking at the speed of that thing, it was completely not something that could be achieved by the natural creatures in this world. At least, according to Luo Fan's understanding, this was the speed that the natural creatures in this world could reach. Even if he had not completely constructed a martial arts system that could be cultivated in this world, the speed that he could achieve with the help of the extraordinary power triggered by the movement was not much of an advantage compared to that thing. If he was not careful, being overtaken wasn't something inconceivable. Who the hell is it? Look at its target, it's clearly heading straight for this village. With that thought in mind, Luo Fan's figure flashed, and he had already arrived outside the village in an instant. After all, he had lived in this village for a few years and had gotten along well with the villagers. Naturally, he could not just watch them fall into a dangerous situation and do nothing. As for the teleportation ability that he was currently displaying, it was needless to say that it was an ability that he had obtained after sorting out the information he had obtained from opening the bridge of heaven and earth. It was an ability that was similar to a superpower. Of course, the biggest difference between him and ordinary people with superpowers was that Luo Fan could control himself to form a specific ability at will, and he could even change this ability at will. In other words, although he had not reached his peak strength, he could almost do anything with this ability at this time. Soon, the thing that came from afar appeared in front of Luo Fan. It was a cultivator who looked like a middle-aged man, rushing straight towards him like a galloping horse. This middle-aged cultivator had the aura of a third tribulation powerhouse lingering around him. He was so powerful that he was at least stronger than all the cultivators that he had met on the second level of the path of Tao Sovereign. Even those rulers seemed to be inferior to this middle-aged cultivator in some aspects. Just from this feeling alone, he was already convinced that this cultivator in front of him was definitely a cultivator from the path of Tao Sovereign. In other words, his identity should at least be similar to that of a cultivator. At this moment, the middle-aged cultivator saw Luo Fan. He was stunned for a moment, then he said with a face full of admiration, as expected of a disciple of a Tao sovereign, "You can actually grasp the power of this world so quickly." Hearing this, Luo Fan only smiled faintly and said, "Fellow Taoist, you guessed wrong. I'm just an independent cultivator, I'm not a disciple of a Tao sovereign." Hearing this, the middle-aged cultivator was suddenly stunned, and he cried out in surprise, "How is this possible?" At this moment, the way he looked at Luo Fan was like he was looking at a monster. Seeing his reaction, Luo Fan only smiled faintly and said, "Fellow Taoist, you must have a lot to say to me, why don't you come to my house and have a chat?" The middle-aged cultivator opened his mouth, and he seemed to be inexplicably conflicted. Through some kind of method, he had sensed the existence of a cultivator who could still possess extraordinary power in this world, so he eagerly rushed over. His goal was obviously not simple. In such a situation, he was suddenly invited to his home by the other party, who treated him like a friend. How could he react in such a situation? At this moment, Luo Fan no longer paid attention to him. He directly raised his hand and pointed at the cultivator. In a flash, he directly used his own ability to bring the cultivator to his house. The entire process, the cultivator couldn't even sense it, let alone resist Luo Fan's carrying. This was also reasonable. Although the cultivator himself had enough power to destroy heaven and earth, he couldn't display any of it in this world. Currently, the cultivator looked like an ordinary person who could control his body more perfectly. He couldn't even condense the true extraordinary power, so how could he possibly resist the extraordinary means that Luo Fan had displayed with the help of the power of this world? It was only natural that he was directly brought here. The cultivator didn't completely react until he appeared here, and he looked around blankly. Finally, he smiled helplessly. "I didn't expect you to be able to cultivate such an incredible ability in this world. It seems that even if you aren't a disciple of a Tao master, you are definitely not inferior to them. In the cultivation world, the weak were prey to the strong. That was the fundamental rule. Now, the strength that Luo Fan displayed was many times stronger than his, and could even decide his life and death at will. Under such circumstances, he could only honestly accept any of Luo Fan's actions. This should be the area that the Tao Master's disciples occupy. Why are there so many people who aren't Tao Master's disciples?" Luo Fan didn't beat around the bush, and directly asked the question that he most wanted to know. Hearing this, the middle-aged cultivator smiled bitterly and said, "Indeed. This is the area that the Tao Master's disciples occupy, but it wasn't from the beginning. In fact, in the beginning, there were both independent cultivators and Tao Master's disciples. However, one day, the Tao Master's disciples reached an unknown agreement and finally worked together to isolate this place, leaving only a small world for the independent cultivators to cultivate and comprehend. As for us cultivators, we are the independent cultivators who weren't sent into that small world after the separation." Sure enough, as I expected. At this moment, such a thought flashed through Luo Fan's mind. Of course, there was no need for him to say this at this time. At this time, he just casually asked, "So, you should have been here for at least 100 trillion years? Why are you still so weak now?" This place must have been separated by the Tao Master's disciples for an extremely long time, at least 100 trillion years. In other words, if this middle-aged cultivator was a cultivator who stayed before the separation, then he must have stayed in the third level of the Tao Master's path for 100 trillion years. However, after such a long period of time, he had only obtained his current strength. He was even slightly inferior to the method he used to mobilize the extraordinary power from the outside world. This kind of improvement speed was really too slow, it was too strange. How could this not surprise him? Hearing this, the middle-aged cultivator was speechless. If he could obtain extraordinary power, he would have done so long ago. How could he still be so weak? Who wouldn't want to be powerful? Looking at the middle-aged cultivator's constipated expression, Luo Fan already had a vague guess in his heart. He understood that there must be some kind of restriction that shackled this cultivator, preventing him from truly grasping extraordinary power. At this moment, he immediately asked, "Fellow cultivator, may I know what kind of difficulty you can't break through?" At this moment, the middle-aged cultivator's eyes lit up. Moreover, the other party even asked such a specific question. This was his opportunity. Regardless of whether the other party wanted to give him pointers or not, to explain the problem clearly, it obviously involved the secrets of cultivation, the key to cultivation. And this, to him, was obviously of the utmost importance. If he was lucky, he could comprehend something from the other party's words, then he could obtain a crucial breakthrough, and from then on soar into the sky. At this moment, he immediately said, "The difficulty I encountered is that my body can't accommodate extraordinary power. Once that extraordinary power enters my body, it will cause a violent reaction with my own strength. In a less serious case, the extraordinary power will dissipate, and in a more serious case, I will be seriously injured and lose a lot of strength." Hearing this, Luo Fan was slightly startled, and his perception instantly swept over the cultivator's body. When his perception swept over the middle-aged cultivator's body, he didn't have any reaction, and he couldn't sense the existence of this perception at all. However, when this perception entered the middle-aged cultivator's body and began to sense the scene inside, there was an earth-shattering change. In an instant, who knew how much power, and how many ideas swarmed over like a monstrous wave, directly drowning his perception. Clearly, for this middle-aged cultivator, although he couldn't move his power outside of his body, making it so that his perception couldn't even detect him when he was so close to him, all of these disadvantages no longer existed. However, once this perception entered his body, all of these disadvantages would no longer exist. The power and might within his body would naturally react to the invading perception. It would either expel it, obliterate it, or allow it to do as it pleases, and so on. At this moment, the middle-aged cultivator instinctively wanted to erase this invading perception. However, at the last moment, he forcefully stopped this impulse. He allowed all the power, and even thoughts in his body to return to their original calm state. He allowed the perception to start to carefully observe and experience his body, inside and out. Chapter 2085. By probing the cultivator's body, Luo Fan quickly discovered the problem with the cultivator. Please search for the latest updates. His way of thinking was really too heterogeneous. Not only did they occupy almost all the space in his body and mind, but there were also a lot of conflicts between them that hindered each other. In this way, the external force that poured into his body would naturally leave his body because there was no room for it. As for him, even if he wanted to use the ideas he had mastered to forcibly confine it in his body, he could not do it because of the conflict of ideas and hindering each other. What a pity. If I could purify it, I would be able to obtain the first strand of extraordinary power in a few days. Looking at the situation in the cultivator's body, Luo Fan could not help but sigh. Apart from this one weakness, this cultivator had already prepared everything else. In other words, as long as he could solve this weakness, he would have been able to obtain a strand of extraordinary power billions of years ago. With that strand of extraordinary power, he could naturally use it to continuously improve and sublimate himself. In the end, he could obtain the supreme divine sense here, which would be of great help to break through the third level of the Tao Master's path. I can help you. At this time, Luo Fan directly said to the cultivator. Hearing this, the cultivator was dumbfounded. Originally, he only had a glimmer of hope, but he did not expect that the other party would dare to make such a conclusion after sensing the situation in his body a little. This made him feel like he was in a dream. As for whether Luo Fan was speaking carelessly or just casually brushing him off, He didn't think about it at all. After all, he was not the kind of person who knew nothing about cultivation. Whether it was true or not, as long as the other party showed him a way, he would naturally know. With the mentality of existences at their level, it was obviously impossible for them to make such a lie that could be exposed almost immediately. After a while of excitement, he looked calm and said, "I don't know what you want. As long as it is within my ability, I will definitely do anything." Luo Fan said faintly, "I need all the information about the third level of the Tao Master's path, including the cultivation holy lands, the dangerous forbidden areas, and how to break through the third level." Although the cultivator in front of him had not really mastered extraordinary power here, he had lived here for billions of years. Naturally, there was no need to say more about his extensive knowledge. Therefore, if Luo Fan wanted to obtain the information about the third level, the best choice was obviously him. Hearing this, the cultivator's heart skipped a beat. He knew that Luo Fan had ascended recently, and there was an inexplicable sense of shock on his face. It should be noted that he had been here for billions of trillions of years, but he still hadn't truly grasped the extraordinary power of this world. On the other hand, his opponent did not even understand the situation here, yet he had already condensed his transcendent power. The gap between them was so huge that it was almost despairing. However, all of these emotions, all of these negative thoughts, were extinguished by him before they could truly emerge. It did not matter how long the other person had cultivated, how much better the other person's aptitude was, or how much more knowledgeable he was. For him, the most important thing now was to find out the reason why he could not condense extraordinary power and solve this problem completely. As long as this problem was solved, with his understanding of the third level of the Tao Master's path, it was almost certain that he would soar to the sky. With this premise, even if the other person insulted him in front of him, he would still greet him with a smile, let alone the other person who was just extraordinary beyond his imagination. The cultivator immediately said, "I can give you all the information. Do you have the ability to read minds? If you do, I'm willing to open my memory to you and let you read it." It went without saying how much information could be obtained from billions of years of experience. If they were to use paper or other media to record it, it would probably take tens of thousands of miles of land and tens of thousands of years to record it down. Therefore, it was obvious that this kind of information could not be transmitted in such a way. In fact, if the middle-aged cultivator had his previous ability, a little bit of spiritual light would be enough to completely store all these memories and easily pass them to Luo Fan. However, it was a pity that this was the purpose of this transaction. How could he have such an ability? Therefore, the only thing he could do now was as he suggested. He opened his mind and let Luo Fan read his memory. Under such circumstances, if Luo Fan's ability was strong enough, he might be able to read all of his memories in just a few breaths and complete the payment of his side's reward. Hearing this, Luo Fan naturally nodded and said, "Mind reading, no problem. As long as you open your mind, I will be able to see everything I want to see." In fact, he only said this to appease the middle-aged cultivator. At this time, if he was willing, he could easily read all the other person's memories without the other person's consent. However, such a forceful method would only make the other person feel extremely intense pain. When the middle-aged man heard this, his expression changed and a trace of passion flashed in his eyes. He had stayed on the third level of the Tao Master's path for billions of years. To him, using extraordinary power was already an extremely distant memory. Under such circumstances, even he could not help but feel excited when he saw that he was about to master extraordinary power again and regain the power he had before entering the third level. In particular, seeing that Luo Fan had only mastered a little bit of transcendent power, yet he was already able to reach such a level, and was even almost omnipotent. How could he not be looking forward to it? "Are you ready?" Luo Fan looked at the middle-aged cultivator and asked. Now that there was such a great disparity between the strong and the weak, he naturally did not act pretentiously. You want to trade? Sure, no problem, but I have to collect the payment first. I'll see if I want to pay you when I'm satisfied. The middle-aged cultivator's expression became serious and he said, It's done, you can start at any time. Although he could not obtain any extraordinary power, the middle-aged cultivator still had his own power and his realm was still not damaged. Naturally, it was not difficult for him to control his own mind. In an instant, in Luo Fan's eyes, the cultivator's mind was like a closed world suddenly opening up, and everything was open to him. Faced with such a change, he no longer hesitated. With a thought, his perception changed and turned into an incomparably wonderful invisible state. It surged towards the cultivator's mind like a tide, wave after wave pouring into the cultivator's mind. It began to constantly seek the cultivator's memory for billions of years, searching for all the information he had collected on the third level. With Luo Fan's control of extraordinary power and his cultivation realm, the process of reading the cultivator's mind was far less time than normal. In the short span of a few breaths, he had already obtained all the information. In an instant, he had become the existence who understood the third level of the Tao Master's path the best. So that's how it is. In order to pass the third level, I have to use the laws of the third level to cultivate extraordinary power that can break through the barrier. Through those memories, he had already understood how to pass the third level of the Tao Master's path. The third level of the Tao Master's path restricted all extraordinary power that did not belong to this world. In order to pass the test, obviously, he had to cultivate the unique extraordinary power of this world according to the laws of this world. And to achieve the effect of ascending, according to the middle-aged man's memories, he had to at least become a false saint of this world, and now, although Luo Fan's performance was so incredible, however, in reality, his attainment in the extraordinary power of this world was only that of a connate martial artist. Not to mention a false saint, there was an unreachable distance between him and a separated immortal. From this, it was obvious how difficult the third level's test was. Apart from this breakthrough goal, Luo Fan had also obtained a lot of information about the third level from his memories. The Holy Land for cultivation, the forbidden area, and the social structure of the third level, etc., had all been grasped by him. And he was also very satisfied with this information. After all, the information was so detailed that it had even exceeded his expectations. It could be said that the cultivator in front of him was indeed an expert under the Tao Master who had been here before the third level was divided. The Tao Master's disciples have built countries in this world. Now this is the territory of the Tianzhan Empire, and this empire was built by the Tao Master's disciple Tianzhan Zi. All the power of the entire empire is serving Tianzhan Zi. Also, there is a third senior brother in the third level. However, this third senior brother is extremely mysterious. Even though he has been here for who knows how many billions of years, he has never seen him. He has never even heard of any accurate information. Luo Fan carefully thought about the information, and his expression changed slightly. After a while, his expression completely returned to normal. He said, I am very satisfied with your memories. Now let us solve your current problem. Hearing this, the cultivator instantly recovered from the discomfort of having his memories read. His eyes seemed to have turned into two shining suns. Please enlighten me, fellow Taoist, he said directly. Luo Fan only smiled faintly and said, Your power is too much and too heterogeneous. This kind of situation leaves your body and mind with no space to integrate with the extraordinary power of this world. To solve this problem, the only way is to purify your power. As long as you purify your power to a sufficient degree, you will naturally be able to obtain extraordinary power. Hearing this, the cultivator was stunned. He did not expect things to be so simple. It was not that there was a problem with his understanding of extraordinary power, nor was it that his body was not suitable for extraordinary power. It was because his body and mind were too full, and there was no space at all. After so many billions of years, I didn't even realize this, he murmured. His expression was a mixture of sadness and joy, pain and regret, but also longing. After saying that, Luo Fan no longer had the desire to speak. For this cultivator, or in other words, for all the cultivators on the path of Tao Master, ideas were a kind of mysterious power. Therefore, he believed that the middle-aged man should know what the power he was talking about was. And as long as he understood how to purify his ideas, it would be a matter of time. As for how to purify the other party, Luo Fan would not give any suggestions. After all, everyone had their own way of doing things, and everyone had their own way of cultivation. Not to mention, helping him to point out what kind of power he was already considered a completed deal. Helping him to purify his ideas was obviously not part of the deal. At this moment, flames suddenly began to emerge from the cultivator's body. They gradually engulfed his whole body, and directly turned him into a man of fire. However, the flames looked so terrifying, as if they were going to burn the sky and destroy the earth. However, even the withered grass at his feet was not ignited by the flames, and Luo Fan, who was standing not far away, did not feel any heat at all. It was as if the flames were just some kind of holographic existence. However, be it Luo Fan or the middle-aged cultivator, they did not care about this at all, because they were quite clear that this was a matter of course. This world repelled all external extraordinary power, and could completely eliminate the effects of all external powers. Although the flames in front of them were not ordinary flames, they obviously did not have the ability to break through the shackles of this world. Therefore, it was naturally impossible for it to produce any effect. In fact, it was already extremely rare for it to produce such flames, which was enough to show how terrifying the power of the flames was. This power could not affect the outside world at all, and it could not change the withered grass at all. However, it was a different story for the middle-aged cultivator who was enveloped by the flames. At this moment, the cultivator's flesh and blood began to quickly burn through, and even his bones began to gradually melt under the flames. As for the 5 viscera and 6 bowels, they had completely disappeared in an instant. Due to this tragic change, bits of strange brilliance emerged from his body. These bits of brilliance did not actually exist. They were actually just changes reflected by the reaction of some kind of power with the flames. Of course, this was only in the eyes of other living beings on the Tao Master path. In fact, in Luo Fan's eyes, these lights were actually the lights of ideas. The reaction between the ideas and the flames was actually a subtle use of the ideas. At this moment, there were probably tens of thousands of specks of starlight. These lights were strong and weak, and their distribution was also chaotic. Some ideas were under the impact of hundreds of other lights, like candlelight swaying in the wind and rain that could be extinguished at any time. Some ideas were like a huge mountain that directly suppressed hundreds of other lights, causing the suppressed lights to also sway in the wind and rain, as if they could collapse at any time. There was also competition between the powerful lights. They constantly collided with each other, constantly hindering the other lights, destroying the stability of the other lights, and themselves being destroyed by the other. Such a scene was really like a gathering of refugees. It would take a lot of effort just to maintain it from collapsing, and it was almost a fool's dream to rely on them to condense a powerful force to achieve a certain effect. Sure enough, without a complete worldview to govern everything, the more ideas there are, the faster one will die. Looking at this scene, Luo Fan had an inexplicable understanding in his heart. In fact, for the middle-aged cultivator, purifying the ideas was only a temporary solution. The real solution to the problems he encountered was actually to condense a worldview that completely belonged to him. There was no need to make this worldview more complete. In fact, as long as there was an outline, a prototype, it would be enough to completely solve the problems he encountered now. After all, as long as there was a worldview, one could naturally integrate these ideas and let them do their own thing. In the end, the chaos and conflict between them would be completely eliminated, and their differences would be reversed. In the end, they would finally be combined into a complete system, so that all the ideas could not only exert the overall superimposed power, but could also complement each other to achieve an incredible sublimation of this power. However, it was clear that this was the key to attaining the Tao. This was the first time they met. How could Luo Fan tell this secret to the middle-aged cultivator? Not to mention that by doing this, there was a great possibility that he would unknowingly walk the path of the reverse that the Tao Master's disciples mentioned, and there would be many tribulations. This was not a choice that the cultivator would make. In contrast, although this method of treating the symptoms could not completely solve the problems that the middle-aged cultivator encountered, it was easy to operate, and the effect was immediate. Why not? At this moment, the flames on the middle-aged cultivator's body began to quickly condense towards the lights, constantly cleansing them, completely cutting off the interaction between the lights, and began to move the lights bit by bit, beginning to recombine the tens of thousands of lights, eliminating the situation where they crushed each other and held each other back. He worked hard to establish a perfect and stable system, and all the lights would form an exquisite whole. It was a pity that without a worldview to unify all these ideas, it was unimaginably difficult to achieve all of this. Chapter 2086. Although it was only a rough system, it had already formed a system after all. The confrontation between all the light spots was greatly reduced, and a large amount of space was released. This kind of situation was like a messy room that seemed to have been stuffed to the brim. However, with a little tidying up, stacking the things that could be stacked on top of each other, placing the things that could be placed up and down, placing the things that could be placed up and down, and making use of the space that could not be used but could be stuffed with a little change in the way they were arranged. Then, the entire room would suddenly become empty. This was what happened to the middle-aged cultivator. The number of light spots did not change, but after tidying them up a little, the feeling of being crowded had completely disappeared, replaced by an inexplicable feeling of emptiness. It felt as if it would not be a problem to stuff tens of thousands of light spots in. Following this change, the middle-aged cultivator's expression suddenly changed, and an indescribable joy appeared between his brows. Amidst this indescribable joy, the light spots that appeared on his body began to quickly disappear and re-enter his body. Immediately after, his body seemed to have turned into a black hole, producing an indescribably huge suction force. As the wind whistled, he began to draw in the endless energy around him. More and more energy that belonged to the world was absorbed into his body, gradually producing some kind of subtle but important transformation. In the end, it turned into an indescribable extraordinary power, and began to naturally construct a circulation system channel inside his body. This channel naturally could not be like Luo Fan's, which was a meridian system of the world. Instead, it was another system that was similarly exquisite and profound. After all, this cultivator had already pushed his cultivation level to the third level of the tribulations. His understanding of cultivation and himself had reached an indescribable height. Under such circumstances, he naturally had his own ideas about cultivation, and he naturally understood what kind of circulation system was suitable for him. Only then would he be able to obtain the greatest benefits. Seeing this, Luo Fan knew that the goal of the cultivator in front of him had been completed. At that moment, he retracted his senses and no longer paid attention to the changes. Instead, he began to read the information that he had obtained from the cultivator's mind. Wanting to use the extraordinary power of this world to become a false sage was so difficult that it was enough to make ordinary cultivators feel despair. But to him it was only a matter of time. After all, with his current understanding of cultivation, there were almost no secrets at the pseudo-sage stage. Even if he had to go through so many detours to obtain this extraordinary power, he did not think that it would be a problem for him. The criteria for breaking through to the third level is this. If that's the case, then there must be a cultivator here who can display this level of strength. An indescribable sense of urgency suddenly welled up in his heart. Invincibility was the norm for him after he became a Tao master. Even in the Tao master great world, although he knew that there were many experts who could defeat him, he had always been close to invincible. Under such circumstances, he was already used to this invincible state. He was already slightly uncomfortable with the need to seek survival and growth by being weak. However, that was good as well. Being invincible all the time, one's mentality would definitely be unbalanced. At that time, it would be detrimental to my cultivation. This thought flashed through his mind, and in the end, this thought replaced all other distracting thoughts. At that moment, his expression became much more determined. Just as he was thinking about it, the middle-aged cultivator on the other side had already woken up. At this moment, he looked many times stronger than before. If he had to make a comparison, no matter how many of him there were, he would not be able to withstand a single finger from the current him. The middle-aged cultivator looked at Luo Fan. There was an inexplicable charm in the depths of his eyes. His entire body seemed to be eager to fight with Luo Fan, however. In the end, he did not dare to make a move because he could not see through Luo Fan's strength. He could only sigh and say, "Thank you for your help. If it wasn't for you, I'm afraid I wouldn't have been able to break through until the end of time. It's just a deal. Since fellow Taoist has succeeded, then I won't keep fellow Taoist here," Luo Fan said. He could naturally see that the middle-aged cultivator wanted to make a move, but he did not care about the other party's choice. The middle-aged cultivator seemed to be well prepared. Due to the many years of experience he had accumulated, his extraordinary power soared into the sky after obtaining it, and the amount of extraordinary power he possessed was almost beyond what he currently possessed. However, with his realm, he could display the same extraordinary power thousands of times more than the middle-aged cultivator before him. Why would he worry about the other party attacking him? In fact, on the contrary, he wanted the other party to immediately make a move. He wanted to see how far his extraordinary power could reach, and how terrifying its might could be. What a pity! With such a thought in his heart, his expression naturally changed. The middle-aged cultivator could not help but feel a chill down his spine when he saw the flash of regret in Luo Fan's eyes. He was extremely glad that he did not choose to make a move earlier. However, at this moment, he remembered that the other party had probed his entire body and knew almost all of his memories. Even if the other party did not have any strength, it would not be difficult for the other party to deal with him. Moreover, he did not know the depth of the other party's strength. If he went up against such an opponent, he would most likely be smashed into pieces by the other party with a single slap. When he thought of this, he was even more glad that he did not make a move earlier. If he had made a move, he might have lost the extraordinary power that he had just obtained after working hard for billions of years. The middle-aged cultivator thought about it and asked Luo Fan solemnly, "I'm Yun. How should I address you, fellow Taoist?" He had finally made up his mind to establish a friendship with Luo Fan. When Luo Fan heard this, he only smiled and calmly told the other party his name. And Yun was overjoyed when he heard this. Telling him his name meant that Luo Fan did not reject establishing a friendship with him. Establishing a friendship with this unknown powerhouse was obviously a great thing for him, so how could he not be happy? At this moment, he said, "I've just obtained the extraordinary power of this world and need to familiarize myself with it. Does fellow Taoist have any recommendations for a place to train?" Luo Fan only smiled and said, "You don't need to come to me for that. With your knowledge, where can't you find a place to train?" However, if fellow Taoist is willing, I might be able to provide some help. And Yun was obviously waiting for the last sentence. He said happily, "That's exactly what I want, and I wouldn't dare to ask for it." When Luo Fan heard this, he smiled. He reached out and grabbed Yun's shoulder. With a thought, he directly activated his extraordinary power and teleported with Yun to the house where he was. After that, Yun decided to stay in this place. The two of them discussed Tao during the day and cultivated at night. Sometimes they would fight and learn from each other when they were impulsive. Everyone's usage of this world's extraordinary power kept improving during this process. It was only natural that Yun could improve. After all, Luo Fan's own realm was much higher than his, and his words were revealed. His words were enough to form a powerful revelation for Yun. As a result, she gained a lot of benefits. It was normal for Yun. In contrast, it seemed strange that Luo Fan could benefit from the Tao discussion. However, in reality, this was only natural. After all, although he had read almost all of Yun's memories, his understanding of cultivation and the understanding of the third level of the Tao Master's Path could not be obtained just by reading Yun's memories. During the conversation with Luo Fan, Yun also constantly integrated her own understanding of the third level of the Tao Master's Path into it. Thus, Luo Fan's understanding of this world became more and more profound. This deeper and deeper understanding naturally gave him a better understanding of the extraordinary powers that could be condensed in this world. As a result, the extraordinary power that he could condense became more and more powerful, and its might became more and more terrifying. This kind of life went on for several months. On this day, Luo Fan sat cross-legged with his eyes closed. Suddenly, his body surged with the sound of rolling waves. The sound was extremely loud, as if there was a huge ocean constantly surging in his body. The waves became louder and louder as time went by. In between the impact, an inexplicable Sanskrit gradually emerged from his body. Above the sky, a faint glow appeared out of thin air. Like a heavenly pillar descending from the sky, it slowly fell on Luo Fan's body. It continuously penetrated into his body and began to undergo some kind of indescribable quenching, causing his body to undergo more and more obvious transformations. This change lasted for dozens of breaths. At a certain moment, a powerful, invisible force rushed out of his body, forming a humanoid shadow in the void. It began to absorb the rays of light falling from the sky, and even more madly absorb the endless power in the surroundings. After the multicolored light and the power rushed into the illusory figure, they began to react rapidly. During this process, wondrous worlds continuously appeared and began to fuse with the illusory figure, causing the nature of the illusory figure to constantly change. The shadow's image was none other than Luo Fan's image. However, it was slightly illusory and not as solid as the real Luo Fan. After the countless worlds were born, they began to reconstruct themselves in a very subtle way inside the shadow, forming a strange system that corresponded to the meridian system in his body, but was more subtle and had more changes. The shadow completely turned into reality, becoming another Luo Fan, a Luo Fan floating in the air. Is this the origin soul? At this moment, Yun, who was cultivating in another room, suddenly woke up. Her eyes seemed to be able to see through all obstacles and see the scene in this room. She murmured to herself. The origin soul was a concept that she had obtained after discussing with Luo Fan over the past few days. This concept came from Luo Fan. It seemed to be the next goal of his cultivation. According to it, once one cultivated the primordial spirit, they would completely cast aside the restrictions of this world on their bodies. From then on, they would become like ordinary living beings in this world, able to improve without any obstacles. In the end, not to mention becoming a false sage. In the end, it would only be a matter of time before they reached their true realm. He actually succeeded. As expected of fellow Taoist Luo Fan, who was able to accomplish what the Tao venerates disciples couldn't as an independent cultivator. And Yun's expression was filled with admiration. Cultivating the origin soul. It was equivalent to cultivating another body. It was equivalent to using the power of this world to recreate one's own body. It sounded simple, but it was very difficult. It was unimaginable. According to Yun's estimation, even if she changed her path, it would take at least tens of millions of years to have a sliver of a chance of cultivating such an origin soul. However, this fellow Taoist in front of her had completed such a breakthrough in such a short time. He had directly linked with the laws of this world and used the changes of the laws themselves. He had completed the construction of the origin soul. How could he not be in awe of this? Luo Fan did not care about Yun's admiration at this moment. This origin soul seemed to be completely condensed by him, but in fact it was condensed by this world, or in other words, the power of the third level of the Tao Venerates path. If it was an ordinary origin soul, it would not be like this. With Luo Fan's own strength, condensing a trace of his will was countless times more powerful than any other origin soul. However, there was nothing he could do. A origin soul condensed in this way could not be condensed by this world. This world, or rather, this world. The third level of the Tao Venerates path could only accept the extraordinary power produced by this world. As for the extraordinary power from the outside world, even the extraordinary power of an existence like Luo Fan, it was extremely repulsive and could not exert any power here. Obviously, if it was condensed by Luo Fan's will, it would completely belong to him. Naturally, it could be regarded as a completely external extraordinary power. In this case, what was the difference between condensing this origin soul and directly exerting the power contained in one's body? Therefore, there was only one way for the primordial spirit to completely become a power that the world could accept. According to the normal cultivation method, the origin soul should be based on the extraordinary power of this world. It should be constantly polished, purified, and improved. Finally, under a certain opportunity, it would give birth to spiritual opportunity and then combine with one's own will. Only then could it form the origin soul that this world could accept. In other words, the origin soul that Luo Fan had condensed now. After condensing this kind of primordial spirit, a feeling of being like a fish in water emerged from the bottom of his heart. In a trance, the restraint of this world on him seemed to have completely disappeared. He seemed to have completely recovered all his strength in the blink of an eye, and could perfectly exert all his power in this world. Of course, this was just an illusion. Soon, he had completely extricated himself from this incomparably wonderful feeling. "After all, I'm still too weak," he muttered with a smile. He was already quite clear about this situation. Although he was still extremely weak, even compared to his body, he only needed to point a finger to directly make hundreds of millions of origin souls disappear. However, with this origin soul, he had already opened the way to heaven. From then on, he could use the most intuitive way to comprehend the rules and laws of this world, improve his cultivation realm in this world, and use the fastest speed to complete the requirements of passing the test, which was to complete the condition to leave the third level of the Tao Master's path. He looked up and swept his eyes. The rules and laws that he could not sense at all had already appeared in his eyes. These strands of rules and laws naturally could not be all the rules and laws of this world. However, it was only the most superficial layer. It could even be said that it was just a speck of dust on a cow's hair. However, even though it was such an insignificant law, it was enough for him to see the vastness and profoundness of this world. This is more complicated than the grand heaven and earth. What level is this world at? With this thought in his mind, his expression became extremely solemn. One should know that the grand heaven and earth, this was already the highest level of the world, according to his understanding. At this time, the most superficial layer of the rules and laws of this world was even more complicated and mysterious than the grand heaven and earth. He could not imagine the level of this world at all. No, it can't be a higher level than the grand heaven and earth. This Tao Master's path was only opened by a true saint. How could a true saint open up a world beyond the grand heaven and earth? Very soon, he denied his previous conjecture in his heart. He felt that it was an absolutely ridiculous conjecture, however, although he denied it in his heart, his expression did not relax at all. Everything else could be faked, but how could the rules and laws be faked? The rules and laws of this world were right here. Apart from the grand heaven and earth, was there any other possibility? Chapter 2087. Obviously, it was impossible for him to get an answer now. After thinking for a while, Luo Fan buried all these doubts in the bottom of his heart. After all, it was impossible to get an answer out of thin air without any reference. After burying these doubts in the bottom of his heart, he began to use this primordial spirit to carefully experience the layer of laws he could sense in this world. Comprehending the laws was the most convenient way to cultivate. If he wanted to cultivate in this world, there was no exception. Moreover, the level of comprehending the laws was not fixed. Although he could only sense the superficial laws at the outermost layer, as his perception of the laws deepened and his primordial spirit strengthened, he would definitely be able to sense more and more moral laws. His understanding of the laws would also definitely deepen. In the end, he might even be able to see through the laws of the entire world. At that time, he might be able to know what was going on in this world, and whether it was a world that surpassed the level of the great world as he boldly guessed. As he sank into this state of comprehension, his primordial spirit was like a dry sponge. It began to frantically devour the endless power around it, constantly condensing it into his primordial spirit and promoting its continuous growth. At the same time, there were traces of power constantly flowing into his body, constantly tempering his body, causing his body to undergo a subtle change. Luo Fan's body had already reached an unbelievable level. Under normal circumstances, the traces of power transmitted by his primordial spirit were billions of times stronger. It was difficult for them to have any effect on his body, and they could not cause any changes to his body. However, at this moment, the situation in this world was completely different from normal. In this place, his body was like the body of an ordinary being. His original strength, his original perfection seemed to not exist here at all. Even though it was just a trace of power, it was enough to cause his body to constantly change. Of course, this change wasn't an upgrade. Instead, it was a subtle change in nature that was constantly occurring. After all, although his body felt like it had no power at all, it was still extremely powerful, reaching the level of a fourth tribulation powerhouse. He was like this. If he wanted to improve further, it would be extremely difficult. It was no longer something that could be done with pure strength. Under such circumstances, even if the power of this world was extremely mystical, it would not be able to withstand it. The laws of this world were also extremely inconceivable. It was impossible for them to surpass the objective reality and rely on these drops of power to increase the strength of their bodies. Under such circumstances, the changes to his body were very obvious. In reality, it was as if he had transformed his originally powerful physique into a way that this world could accept. He had only released a tiny bit of it from the looks of it. His body seemed to have undergone some subtle changes under the tempering of this power, as if it had started to improve in some aspect. With such a change, the interior of the house that Luo Fan was in started to have all sorts of subtle lights circulating endlessly. Waves of energy gathered from all directions, bringing with them the whistling sound of the wind as they continuously poured into the house. The strange phenomenon was extremely shocking. This sort of change was simply shocking to Yun, who was standing by the side. Even though he had already obtained extraordinary power, even though he had been accumulating power for billions of years, and his speed of improvement was unimaginably fast. However, after this period of cultivation, He had only barely reached the level that Luo Fan had been at when he had first met him. Although it was not too far away for him to achieve a breakthrough, it was not something that could be achieved in just a few decades. However, the person beside him, who was about the same level as him not long ago, had achieved such a huge breakthrough in such a short time. It went without saying how much of a shock it was to Enyun. I have to work hard too. If I'm really left far behind, wouldn't that mean that I'm not qualified to discuss Tao with him? He muttered with a determined look on his face. It wasn't impossible for him to improve himself quickly. However, that method was quite risky. If he failed, it would be a great burden to his cultivation, and he would need to spend a lot of time to make up for it. It was precisely because of this danger that he had not used this method all along. It was only now that he had been provoked by Luo Fan that he made up his mind to use this method. Of course, he could not put all the blame on Luo Fan. After all, Enyun was an extremely rational and intelligent cultivator. If such a person did not have any inclination, he would definitely not do it no matter how much of a provocation he was. Since he was willing to do it now, it was obvious that he really wanted to do it, but he could not find the right opportunity. This time, the provocation that Luo Fan gave him had clearly been treated as an opportunity, or rather, a way out of his current predicament. Immediately, Enyun's expression turned solemn, and crackling sounds began to come from within his body. As the sounds rang out, the vast energy in his body began to circulate wildly. It quickly seeped into his body, and with a twist, his body was instantly torn apart. As his body was torn apart, the extraordinary power that he had condensed that completely belonged to the world began to appear out of thin air. It existed among the countless fragments of his body in a way that surpassed the reality when he was in perfect condition. The extraordinary power was naturally completely different from Luo Fan's extraordinary power. Compared to Luo Fan's ever-changing extraordinary power that seemed to be able to derive countless special characteristics, the extraordinary power that appeared among the fragments of Enyun's body was sharper and more stable. It felt like it was the embodiment of the concepts of sharpness and stability. After the extraordinary power appeared, it began to frantically devour the endless energy around it. It started to devour the boundless power around it. In the process, it kept devouring the fragments of Enyun's body. In the blink of an eye, everything happened. All the fragments that belonged to Enyun's body had been devoured by the extraordinary power. After devouring so many fragments of Enyun's body, the extraordinary power itself didn't change at all. It looked as if it hadn't devoured anything at all, and it was still slowly circulating in the same place. With such changes, the extraordinary power's attraction to the external energy began to grow stronger. Fortunately, Luo Fan was frantically absorbing energy nearby, so the energy concentration in this area was much higher than in other areas. Because of that, Enyun's extraordinary power didn't become empty or collapse because it couldn't absorb enough energy. Instead, it began to revolve in an orderly manner. It changed in an orderly manner. Gradually, it began to transform in an orderly manner. In the end, the extraordinary power gathered on the spot like a small cocoon of light, stretching and shrinking as if it was breathing or beating a heart. Every time it expanded and contracted, it would disappear into the cocoon of light. Every time it beat, a large amount of energy would be poured into it and disappear into the cocoon of light. If Luo Fan was watching all of this, he would be able to tell very quickly. Apart from energy, the laws of this world were also pouring into the cocoon of light. In other words, there were strands of laws of this world being pulled into the cocoon of light by an inexplicable suction force at every moment. After a certain effect was produced, the laws would flow out in another direction. And so on and so forth, the cycle began again and again, never to stop. Time passed bit by bit in this process. 1 day, 2 days, 3 days, 10 days, 1 month, 1 year, 10 years, unknowingly, 36 years had passed. On this day, The cocoon of light that Yun had transformed into trembled slightly, and the frequency of its beating suddenly increased by several times. At the same time, banging sounds constantly came from within. After so many years of development, the cocoon of light was no longer as insignificant as it was in the past. Instead, it had turned into a cocoon of light that was as tall as a person. Such a cocoon of light quietly floated in the void. As it stretched and shrank, it constantly absorbed the endless energy and laws of the world around it. At some point, the cocoon of light's beating became one, and in the end, it completely disappeared. After that, the entire cocoon of light suddenly shook, and an extremely powerful force instantly exploded from within. With a loud bang, the surrounding houses instantly collapsed, and strong winds swept in all directions without any cover. For a time, sand and stones were sent flying, and the scene was extremely chaotic. Then, a figure appeared where the cocoon of light originally was, hugging its knees as if it was in a mother's womb. Its head was buried between its legs. That figure was none other than Yun. However, at this moment, Yun no longer gave off the aura that was originally incompatible with this world. Instead, there was a mysterious aura that was extremely harmonious with the world, as if it was a part of it. Under this aura, he did not even need to absorb it. The energy and laws of the world around him had already naturally flowed into his body, and began to naturally transform into extraordinary power that completely belonged to him. It began to slowly circulate around his body, and gradually refined his body, causing his body to undergo various subtle and mysterious transformations. It seemed like he was constantly growing. "It seems like I've succeeded," Yun muttered as he opened his eyes. There was a hint of confusion in his eyes at first, but it was soon followed by a burst of pleasant surprise. He spread out his body, and after a slight sensing, he discovered that he was different from before. If he was said to be like a wooden bucket with a body full of power before, then he was now like a river that did not know where to start. Previously, no matter how much power there was in the wooden bucket, it could not leak out. It could only keep swaying in it, and even sounds could not be heard because of the soundproofing of the wooden bucket. However, at this moment, he did not even need to control it. Just the flow of the stream itself was enough to produce a terrifying effect that was enough to devour all living things. Faced with such a situation, Yun was full of joy. Fortunately, he's gathering his power to cultivate at this moment. Otherwise, I'm afraid he's going to fail this time. Yun thought to himself, and he looked a little relieved. What he had done just now was to rebuild his body. The reason why he was incompatible with this world, and couldn't unleash his boundless power, was because his body didn't belong to this world. His power didn't belong to this world. His power did not belong to this world. Because of this reason, then, the most direct solution was revealed. It was nothing more than to transform his body into a body that was born and bred in this world, and transform his power into the power of this world, obviously, although he was far inferior to Luo Fan. Nevertheless, he was still a cultivator who had stepped into the third level of the Tao Master Path. According to the classification of the Tao Master Path, his strength was at least a 3 tribulation expert. In this way, his body was strong and his power was vast. His essence was so high that it had reached an unimaginable level. It was not impossible for him to transform such a powerful body with his shallow attainments in extraordinary power in this world. However, it was so difficult that it was almost beyond the imagination of all cultivators. Over the past 30 years, what Yun had done was to rely on his understanding of his body and the extraordinary power that he had condensed to break up his whole body from the weakness of his body. Then, he used the extraordinary power to breed his body again, and then used the power of this world to refine his power, so that the direction of the extraordinary power's breeding of his body would not be affected by his original power, and it would be stable on the essence of this world. In this way, he naturally had to suppress the power in his body. With the cooperation of his body, such a power did not need to be very strong. However, the quantity must be great. If he didn't have enough, even if he wanted to suppress and transform his own power, it would be like a housewife without rice. It would be impossible for him to do it. In other words, if he wanted to complete this transformation, the most important thing was to have a source that could continuously provide him with a huge amount of power. Obviously, in the past decades, Luo Fan had been the source of this power. Perhaps, strictly speaking, it was not him. Instead, it was him who triggered the change of this world to provide the endless power for an Yun. It could be said that if Luo Fan did not exist, or if Luo Fan did not maintain that state of cultivation for over 30 years, an Yun would definitely not have succeeded. When an Yun woke up, Luo Fan had already sensed it. He did not notice at first that an Yun used the power that he attracted to complete his cultivation. However, after a few decades, he finally noticed it. Regarding this, he did not think too much about it. He did not feel depressed from being taken advantage of, nor did he feel gratified from watching someone grow. All he felt was calmness. After all, he did not suffer any losses or gain from this. He could only absorb a small portion of the power that he attracted. The majority of the power would eventually dissipate into the world and rejoin the power cycle of this world. Under such circumstances, what an Yun absorbed naturally wouldn't affect her cultivation at all. Since it was not affected, he would not feel any negative emotions because of it. Although an Yun had established some friendship with him, they had only known each other for a short while. Naturally, her growth would not make him feel gratified. At this moment, Luo Fan sensed that an Yun had completed her cultivation. With a thought, his origin spirit, which had grown several hundred times, shook slightly and arrived outside where an Yun cultivated. The moment he arrived, an Yun sensed that it did not mean that Luo Fan's origin spirit had called out to her. She stood up and condensed a loose robe with her extraordinary power. In a flash, she left the house and arrived in front of Luo Fan's origin spirit. Currently, Luo Fan's origin spirit looked no different from a real body of flesh and blood. In fact, compared to his physical body, his origin spirit seemed even more real. Its sense of existence was even greater than his physical body. Standing next to it, an Yun looked more like a primordial spirit. An Yun was first shocked when she saw Luo Fan's origin spirit. Then, she bowed and thanked him. After all, it was because of Luo Fan's help that she could achieve what she had today. Luo Fan only smiled and declined her gratitude. He said, "Since you've improved, why don't we have a spar again?" This was exactly what an Yun wanted to hear. The direct reason why he had taken the risk was to catch up with Luo Fan and not be left too far behind. At this time, when he heard that there was an opportunity to directly compete with Luo Fan, how could he not be willing? The two of them immediately got into position and stood opposite each other, intending to start their sparring session after decades of separation. After several decades, Luo Fan and an Yun's existence had long been accepted by the villagers in this village. After all, to the villagers of this village, even though they possessed an incomparably terrifying power, any one of them would be enough to destroy the world if they were brought to another world. However, because they had almost no cultivation base, their power was only power. It could not be converted into something that they relied on for longevity. Therefore, lifespan was the biggest shackle for them. In other words, they could not escape birth, old age, illness, and death at all. Chapter 2088. A person who had lived here for 2 generations, even if he was an outsider, would naturally be regarded as a part of this village by the new generation. Under such circumstances, Luo Fan and an Yun naturally became recognized residents of this village. Even though not many people had seen them on this day, the two of them appeared out of thin air on this open space, and a strange phenomenon soared into the sky, attracting the attention of the villagers in the village. In an instant, figures came from all over the village. In the blink of an eye, there were dozens of spectators. Most of them were children. Their eyes were full of curiosity and anticipation when they looked at Luo Fan and Anyun. They had heard since they were young that there were two extremely powerful experts living here, and their parents and grandparents had always warned them not to get close to this place. Therefore, although they knew that the experts were beside them, they had never seen the true faces of the experts. It went without saying that they were excited to see them at this time. In fact, some of them even thought that they could learn some extraordinary skills from their movement. Neither Luo Fan nor Anyun cared about their thoughts. Although the native creatures in this world contained infinite power, and their level of power was not lower than that of a false saint. However, because of their realm, they were not much different from ordinary people in the eyes of the two of them. In fact, they did not know how to use their power. Instead, they grew old and died like ordinary people. In the eyes of the two of them, they were even more inferior in such a situation. How could they possibly take these native creatures seriously? There was no difference between being watched by them and being watched by ants. Therefore, at this time, neither of them had any change in expression because of the other residents watching them. They only had eyes for each other. Although Enyun's strength had improved greatly, she still knew her own limits. She knew that compared to Luo Fan, she was still inferior to him sometimes. Therefore, she did not want to let Luo Fan make the first move. Instead, with a thought, his body swayed, and he took the initiative to pounce at Luo Fan. The transcendent power that he had mastered was not weak at all. Moreover, his body had been nurtured by the transcendent power and was highly compatible with it, so his power had become unimaginably powerful. But, in his eyes, this kind of extraordinary power was still insignificant. The effect he achieved was also far beyond his own expectations. In this way, in battle, he naturally wouldn't be too willing to rely solely on this extraordinary power. At this moment, extraordinary power surged on his body. Powerful energy circulated around his body, and his body began to emit a faint golden light. Under this kind of light, his body seemed to possess a kind of indestructible quality. It seemed that even if the world was destroyed, his body would not be affected in the slightest. Not even the slightest bit of damage would remain on his body. Amidst the changes, he threw a punch at Luo Fan. The punch contained thousands of changes. The surrounding world began to flow and change due to this punch, and the laws began to surge naturally. Unimaginable power was emitted from the surging laws, and even the surrounding space-time began to distort indescribably. If such a punch was unleashed in any other world, even a perfect world, it would definitely collapse under this punch. The laws of the entire world would definitely collapse. Even if the world wasn't completely destroyed, it would definitely fall back into the process of rebirth. Faced with such a punch, Luo Fan's expression was rather calm. Enyun's body had been nurtured by the transcendent power, and it had become unimaginably compatible with the world and the transcendent power. Although his primordial spirit did not go through this process, its essence was not inferior. It should be noted that the primordial spirit was born from the transcendent power, so it had the advantage of not being limited by the physical body compared to the primordial spirit. At this moment, all the changes in the surrounding laws, space-time, and even the changes in power were all reflected in his heart. In an instant, he understood the essence of Enyun's attack. With a thought, he raised his hand and made a grabbing motion, grabbing the fist in his hand. All the power that the fist carried was instantly erased by him. As for the tens of thousands of changes brought about by that fist, not a single one of them was left out by him. After that, his body trembled, and his primordial spirit instantly collapsed, turning into a world that directly enveloped Enyun. At this moment, Enyun felt as if she had left the path of a Tao master and re-entered another world, another heaven and earth. A restriction that was even stronger than the restriction on him on the third level of the Tao master path was directly imposed on him. In a trance, he felt as if he had returned to the time when he first stepped into the third level. The feeling of having infinite power but being unable to use it spontaneously arose. At this moment, his face could not help but turn slightly pale. Even the golden light on his body that was produced by the operation of the transcendent power began to fade. As for the feeling of indestructibility that was produced by the golden light, it also completely disappeared. At this moment, lightning flashed in the sky and a giant appeared out of thin air. This figure looked exactly like Luo Fan. After the giant appeared, he directly slapped down on Yun. This action was violent and powerful, as if he did not show any mercy. At this moment, Yun roared and the transcendent power on his body erupted wildly. The powerful power emitted an indescribable golden light and his body seemed to suddenly break through some kind of shackles. He began to grow rapidly and in the blink of an eye, he had already grown to the same size as the giant. After he grew to this size, he pounced on the giant without hesitation. He didn't hesitate to rush towards the giant. The golden light on his body condensed into a long river that wrapped around him and protected him as he rushed towards the giant Luo Fan. Under this impact, heaven and earth began to distort unceasingly. Cracks appeared around the figure. From these cracks, one could even see the scene inside the village. One could see the many villagers who were watching. Good. At this moment Luo Fan praised. A mirror instantly appeared in the giant's hand. A ray of light shot out from the mirror and directly hit Yun's body. The endless golden light that wrapped around Yun's body was instantly shattered, causing his body to deflate like a deflated balloon. At this moment, Yun had already seen through the truth of heaven and earth and was able to use his transcendent power again. But how could he admit defeat so easily? At this moment, his transcendent power produced all kinds of indescribable changes. It condensed into all kinds of strange phantoms of heaven and earth and brazenly collided with the light shot out from the mirror. In the midst of an earth-shattering explosion, the light shot out from the mirror was completely shattered. At the same time, the phantoms continued to collapse. Seeing this, Luo Fan attacked again without hesitation. The mirror dissipated in an instant, and rays of mysterious light condensed, forming countless blades in the void, as though they were alive. With the support of the nomological laws, they frantically pounced at Yun with endless power. In the face of such an attack, Yun's eyes lit up. His body trembled, and the golden light emitted once again. The intense feeling of indestructibility appeared once again. He didn't use any other methods and directly threw himself into the midst of the endless swords and soldiers, engaging in an incomparably brutal battle with them. This battle caused heaven and earth to collapse and the earth to overturn. Even the nomological laws could not withstand the impact of this battle. In the end, the entire world became extremely chaotic. In the end, after a few days, the entire world collapsed and the two of them returned to the village. At this moment, Luo Fan was still as calm and composed as before. In contrast, Yun, who seemed to have the upper hand, was already battered and exhausted. "I didn't expect that I couldn't even defeat your world projection." Yun looked at Luo Fan with reluctance and excitement in her eyes. Just now, Luo Fan seemed to have transformed his world projection into his world projection to fight her. In fact, it was only a world projection projected by his world projection. Such a projection could indeed display most of his world projection's strength. However, it did not truly represent all of his strength. Given Luo Fan's world projection, it would not be a problem for him to project thousands of world projections if he wanted to. Not to mention that his world projection could also personally attack. Under all these restrictions, using this heart world projection to fight could be said to be nothing more than a game to him. How could Yun not feel unwilling to be treated like this? As for her excitement, it was needless to say. The battle that lasted for 3 days and 3 nights just now was the best experience for him. Through the 3 days of almost endless battle, he had truly mastered his extraordinary power and developed a lot of abilities from it. Although these abilities were still insignificant compared to his original abilities, they were much stronger than before. It could be said that if he were to fight with the world projection from 3 days ago, he would definitely be able to easily subdue the world projection from 3 days ago in just a few breaths. It's just a sparring session. Luo Fan smiled. Although he did not use his full strength during the 3 days and 3 nights of battle, his battle with Yun had allowed him to comprehend many mysteries that he had not comprehended before. It allowed him to use his extraordinary power more intricately, and it allowed him to develop his soul more deeply. Compared to 3 days ago, although he did not have a qualitative improvement, he had become stronger. To him, this was already something worth being pleasantly surprised about. And Yun looked at Luo Fan and said with a sigh, "I'm leaving." Upon hearing this, Luo Fan was not surprised. He nodded and said, "I guess so too." Foreign Yun. Now that the biggest obstacle in his cultivation had been overcome, from now on, he would have to face a lot of difficulties. From now on, his cultivation would not be smooth sailing, but the real obstacles would no longer exist. Under such circumstances, cultivating in seclusion was obviously not the best way for him to cultivate. Therefore, staying here was not a waste of time. However, it had already greatly slowed down his cultivation progress. In this case, it was only natural for him to leave. In fact, Luo Fan had already understood this at the beginning, so he was naturally not surprised at this time. "Thank you for your guidance these days." And Yun looked at Luo Fan and bowed solemnly to express her gratitude. Luo Fan smiled and bowed back. After all, they were both cultivators, so there was no need to ask him to stay. Since he had made it clear, Yun did not stay any longer. She did not even return to her house. She turned around and left. When he came, he was directly carried by Luo Fan and teleported, but when he left, he was already able to teleport himself. In a flash, his figure had already disappeared in front of Luo Fan and the numerous villagers. At this moment, the village chief plucked up his courage. He went forward to greet Luo Fan. That's right, although he was the village chief, he could only greet Luo Fan with a respectful attitude at this time. After all, regardless of the world, what determined one's status was still strength. Although the village chief had some extraordinary means because of the extraordinary skills that Luo Fan had taught him, he was superior to the other villagers. However, compared to an existence like Luo Fan, he was still a long way off. What kind of attitude would such an existence have towards Luo Fan? Was there even a need to say more? "What's the matter?" Luo Fan asked calmly. If he wanted to, he would know what the village chief wanted to do in an instant. However, it was obvious that the village chief did not have the right to make him guess. The village chief's body trembled when he heard this. He said, "We shouldn't say much about Senior's great kindness to our village. However, our village is in trouble this time, and we have no choice but to ask for Senior's help." Luo Fan frowned when he heard this. He asked, "What trouble is our village facing?" Hearing that Luo Fan did not immediately turn around, the village chief was overjoyed and said, "A demon has come from the nearby mountains and captured the hunters who had gone out to hunt. It ate more than a dozen of them and released one. It said that in the future, it will only spare the village if we offer 3 virgin boys or girls every month. If we are not willing to send them over, it will make sure that not even the chickens and dogs of the village remain." Luo Fan could not help but frown when he heard that. He was not affected by the village's encounter. After all, they were living creatures that were born and bred in this world. They were part of the cycle of this world. It was normal for them to eat other living creatures and be eaten by other living creatures. What he was concerned about was the fiendish demon. What kind of fiendish demon is it? How powerful is it? He asked right away. There were all kinds of powerful living creatures in this world, including cultivators and fiendish demons. He knew that a long time ago. Moreover, He had seen all kinds of mysterious and unbelievable sceneries from Yun's memories. However, those were only memories after all. He still had no idea what a real fiendish demon looked like or what was so special about it. Under such circumstances, how could he not be tempted when he heard that he could have a chance to meet a fiendish demon? The village chief was even more excited when he heard that. He immediately exaggerated how terrifying the fiendish demon was, however. His exaggeration did not mean much to Luo Fan. In the end, after he explained everything, he still had no idea what the demon was like, what kind of strength it had, or how terrifying it was. It seems like the fiendish demon is much more powerful than the villagers. It's beyond their comprehension. With that thought, he said, "Where is the fiendish demon? Is there anyone who knows the way? Ask them to bring me there." The village chief immediately knelt on the ground and kowtowed continuously to show his gratitude to Luo Fan. At the same time, the other villagers were also excited. They knelt on the ground with expressions of surprise and gratitude. Luo Fan frowned slightly. Fortunately, the village chief knew what was more important. After expressing his gratitude, he stood up and pulled a burly man over. "He's the hunter that was released by the fiendish demon. He knows how to find the fiendish demon. With him leading the way, Senior will definitely be able to find the fiendish demon." Luo Fan looked at the hunter and saw that his body was filled with a ferocious aura. However, his eyes were filled with fear. It was as if he had experienced some kind of unbelievable and shocking change. There were too many lingering shadows in his mind. Seeing his reaction, Luo Fan was even more interested in the fiendish demon. To be able to make a hunter like that, the fiendish demon must have some tricks up its sleeve. He grabbed the hunter and a magic cloud appeared under his feet. He dragged them up into the air and into the sky. Everyone was dumbfounded when they saw the scene of an immortal traveling. They all knelt on the ground and kowtowed continuously. At this moment, the hunter's eyes were also shining with an indescribable light. The fear that was so thick that it could not be dispelled gradually dissipated. A ray of hope reappeared in his eyes. Obviously, the abilities that Luo Fan had displayed indicated that he could defeat the fiendish demon. Chapter 2089. Under the hunter's guidance, Luo Fan quickly brought him to the mountain peak where the magical beasts were entrenched. Miasma covered most of the mountain peak, and from afar, it looked like a dragon's lair and tiger's den. Of course, with the magical beasts around, it was obviously more dangerous than a dragon's lair and tiger's den. "It's here." The hunter looked at the mountain peak, and his face was filled with fear. Even his voice was slightly trembling. Seeing this, Luo Fan nodded. Since he had confirmed the target, the hunter was naturally of no use. Then, he swung his arm, and the hunter was thrown to the ground. Of course, with the hunter's body strength, if he collided with the horrifying ground without any buffer, he would almost certainly be turned into minced meat. However, it was obvious that Luo Fan did not want to silence the hunter. Naturally, he would not let the hunter die just like that. When he shook the hunter off, there was already a surge of potential added to the hunter's body. The moment the hunter landed, he naturally received a cushioning force, which directly removed the impact force from his collision with the ground. In the end, he landed lightly on the ground without any impact at all. After landing, the hunter did not even realize that he had landed on the ground. After shaking the hunter off, Luo Fan did not even pay attention to him, and his body directly crashed into the mountain peak in front of him without any hesitation. This world was different from any other world. In any material matter, each of them had a nearly perfect heaven and earth. In the miasma, in the smoke. It was the same in the sand and stones of the mountain. Under normal circumstances, if this mountain range in front of him was placed in other places, it would probably be regarded as a large area in the state of chaos. However, at this moment, Luo Fan had already mastered the extraordinary power of this world. Compared to this kind of extraordinary power, it was much more powerful. The material of this world, the world inside the material, was no different from ordinary materials. Naturally, he could do whatever he wanted to do with it. Under such circumstances, he naturally did not have to worry about the environment of this mountain affecting him. There was no need to think about it at all. As soon as he entered the fog, he felt an indescribable pressure envelop his body. This kind of pressure was extremely weak. It was born from the extraordinary power of this world. In other words, this mist was actually created by someone with extraordinary power in this world. Combined with the location of this place, he naturally understood. The one who set up the mist was most likely that demon. At this moment, an angry voice sounded, "This is my territory. Get lost." The voice rolled like waves, covering the sky and covering the earth. It made people feel like they had become willow catkins that could only drift with the wind. "You've got some tricks up your sleeve." However, Luo Fan only said one sentence before he casually tore the surrounding fog apart. The surging sound waves that resembled that of a sea wolf had completely disappeared at this moment. At the very least, in the direction where he was, the sound waves that could affect him had already been completely eliminated. This method rendered the fiendish demon speechless for a moment. The extraordinary power that Luo Fan used just now did not seem very strong. In fact, he even felt that he could exert extraordinary power that was 100 times stronger than this. However, the effect of this transcendent power was something that he had never imagined. Normally, he would only be able to achieve such an effect even if he used thousands of times more extraordinary power. Under such circumstances, it went without saying how much stimulation it had for him to see Luo Fan use such a method. At this moment, Luo Fan had already seen through the entire layout of the mist through the distribution of extraordinary power in the mist. He also saw where the existence that created the mist was. At this moment, he had a thought and his eyes were already locked on a location halfway up the mountain. There was a small cave there. Compared to the mountain peak, this cave was an insignificant existence. However, there was an indescribable aura at this moment, as if it had become the most important core of the entire mountain. All the power and matter in the entire mountain were revolving and changing around this cave. At this moment, the surrounding mist began to churn wildly. However, the mist did not attack Luo Fan to regain control of the area he was in. Instead, it began to roll back and quickly surged into the small cave halfway up the mountain. It looked like the entire mountain had been completely enveloped by a tornado, and the cave was the tail end of the tornado. All the mist kept flowing towards the cave as the tornado rotated. In the end, it completely entered the cave and disappeared without a trace. Luo Fan did not stop this change. At this moment, he just quietly watched all the changes in the mist and watched the means that the demon used in the process. Not long after, all the fog disappeared into the cave, and the entire mountain became clear. Then, bang 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 bang, loud noises came from the cave. Or rather, they came from the inside of the mountain. With this sound, the entire mountain seemed to shake slightly, as if it was under unimaginable pressure. In the end, it could not bear it and was about to collapse under the pressure. It should be known that this mountain was the mountain in the 3rd level of the Tao Master's Road. The amount of heaven and earth contained within it was unimaginable. It goes without saying how strong one must be in order to shake such a mountain. Just the power that could shake this mountain was enough. In other worlds, even in the Tao Master world, it was enough to become an overlord. With that sound, Luo Fan became even more interested in the demon. With such power, even if the demon did not have a high enough realm, it was still qualified for him to study. When the banging sound became louder and closer, a figure. Gradually, it came out of the small cave. He saw that figure clearly. Luo Fan could not help but be slightly stunned. The figure was not as huge as he had imagined. It was only about 6 feet tall, which was naturally much taller than the average person. But compared to the size of the demon that he had imagined, compared to the terrifying power that had almost shaken the entire mountain, it was obviously too small. The demon had a green face and fangs. Its whole body was covered with fine black scales, and there were traces of a wolf on its face. When it opened its mouth, its sharp teeth shone with a cold light. As for the pair of eyes that contained endless fierceness, it gave people the feeling that it was enough to tear the world into pieces. Slightly sensing the strength of the demon, Luo Fan looked a little satisfied. In terms of the level of this world, the strength of this demon was actually a little higher than his. If it was an analogy, Luo Fan's current level in this world was equivalent to a cultivator who had just cultivated the primordial spirit. He was still several realms away from becoming an individual immortal. However, the strength of the demon in front of him was already equivalent to a realm above the primordial spirit realm. Although there was still a long way to go before he reached the realm of a loose immortal, compared to Luo Fan. But he was already one step closer. In the face of this kind of demon whose realm was higher than his, Luo Fan was not the least bit nervous. At this time, there was a faint smile on his face, and he said, "I won't say any reason. You either surrender or die. Choose one." Hearing this, the demon was instantly enraged. It had not been easy for him to cultivate his current ability and occupy this remote and unoccupied place. A good life was about to begin, and now someone actually told him to surrender or die. This was simply pulling his face off, throwing it on the ground and stepping on it. If this could be tolerated, what else in this world could not be tolerated? At this moment, he roared angrily and leaped up. Like a bolt of lightning, he charged at Luo Fan. As he charged, the black fog on his body surged and condensed into a huge claw that attached itself to his claws. Following his movements, he directly grabbed at Luo Fan. As he grabbed, the surrounding space made sizzling sounds, and all kinds of subtle distortions appeared in the surrounding space. Even the dust in the air was directly crushed in the process, releasing a power that could shake the void and intensifying the shocking distortions. In the face of such a grab, Luo Fan's expression did not change. He did not even make a move. With a slight thought, the surrounding heaven and earth changed naturally, and there was a subtle change in the rules and laws that he sensed. This subtle change was naturally so insignificant compared to the complete rules and laws of the entire world. However, compared to any living being, it was already powerful enough to shake everything. At this moment, in the face of such a change, the devil could not resist at all. The fog on his body had already collapsed, and even the world in his eyes had undergone earth-shattering changes. Luo Fan, who hadn't changed in the slightest, seemed to have turned into an indomitable giant, staring at him with a condescending gaze. An incomparably powerful spiritual pressure made him instantly lose all ability to resist. His body was like an ordinary stone, falling straight down. Not long after, he was forcefully smashed into the ground below, causing the ground to emit a violent tremor. Fortunately, the devil had been tempered by extraordinary power, and his body had long been hard to an unimaginable level. Although such a collision made him spit out a few mouthfuls of blood, it was ultimately a matter of a few mouthfuls of blood. In the end, his life was still saved. Although his realm of extraordinary power is rather high, it's only at a level that even itinerant immortals can't achieve. At this moment, such a thought flashed through Luo Fan's mind. One must know that Luo Fan's realm of extraordinary power in this world was only at the level of cultivating his primordial spirit. However, his realm was at the level of a fourth tribulation powerhouse who had gone through 4 major tribulations. Such a level of realm. What he could do with the same extraordinary power. It was billions of times more powerful than normal. In other words, even if he could not use extraordinary power to fully unleash his might and strength, it was not a problem for him to surpass connate Grand Luo cultivators. Under such circumstances, the devil had relied on his strength that had not become an itinerant immortal to fight him. He was really overestimating himself to the extreme. With a thought, he grabbed out, and the unconscious devil below, who had already spat out blood, floated up into the air. It did not take long for him to arrive in front of him. "Don't play dead," Luo Fan said calmly when he saw the devil, whose eyes were tightly shut as if he had fainted. As he said that, the devil's body shuddered, and his eyes slowly opened. At this moment, there was no longer the ruthlessness and cruelty in his eyes. There was only fear, ingratiation, and even flattery. He looked like he had turned into a domesticated puppy. "Master, I submit," he said directly. "Where did you come from?" Luo Fan asked calmly. As he said that, he loosened his grip, and the devil was already falling uncontrollably. At this moment, the devil reacted and quickly steadied his body. Finally, after falling several meters, he returned to his original state and floated in the air. Reporting to Master. "I'm from the demon region. Because I was ostracized by the other demons, I had no choice but to come to this remote place. I didn't mean to offend you. If I knew that this was Master's territory, I definitely wouldn't have dared to come here." The devil went on and on. Hearing this, Luo Fan frowned. He had seen the demon region in Yun's memory. The demon region was also a region controlled by a Tao master. Compared to the billions of other regions, there was no essential difference. However, it was said that the demon realm itself was separated by more than a dozen regions. In other words, they were separated by more than a dozen Tao masters. Under such circumstances, the fiendish demon from the demon realm could actually appear here, and from the sound of it, it seemed that the fiendish demon was not the only one. This situation was not simple no matter how one looked at it. After thinking for a while, he shook his head and dismissed all these thoughts. No matter what problems or disputes there were among the disciples of the Tao Masters, it was meaningless to him. At this moment, he directly asked about what he was concerned about. "What cultivation method do you cultivate? Let me see." The devil was slightly stunned. What he cultivated was the most common cultivation method in the demon region. Why would this abnormally strong person in front of him be interested in such a common cultivation method? However, although he was puzzled, he obviously did not dare to disobey Luo Fan's will. At this moment, he directly took out a piece of stone from his arms and presented it directly. He said, "This is the demon forging technique that I've cultivated. Master, please have a look." Luo Fan made a grabbing motion, and the piece of stone fell into his hand. With a slight movement of his heart, the information contained in the stone flowed directly into his heart like water and was easily received by him. What was recorded on the stone was the cultivation method of demons called the demon forging technique. This cultivation method was quite exquisite, and it involved countless mysteries of the rules of heaven and earth. Even though it was only the first 6 levels of the demon forging technique in front of him now, it was already an eye-opener for Luo Fan. He had a clearer understanding of the rules of heaven and earth that he had vaguely sensed before. Not a bad technique. Immediately, he exclaimed in admiration. This compliment stunned the fiendish demon for a moment. After all, the demon forging technique itself could be said to be a common cultivation method. In the demon region, almost every devil could easily obtain the first few levels. This expert in front of him actually said that such a cultivation method was good. This simply subverted the devil's worldview. It made him feel that the demon forging technique that he knew was not the same cultivation method as the demon forging technique that he knew well. If Master wants the later levels of the cultivation method, it's actually not very difficult. At that moment, he said with some hesitation. But Luo Fan just smiled faintly. In terms of the circulation path of the extraordinary power, this technique was actually not very exquisite. What he valued was the understanding of heaven and earth, the use of the rules of heaven and earth, as well as the deep transformation method of the heaven and earth contained in this cultivation method. After all, this was an extraordinary cultivation method that could be cultivated in this world. Based on the nature of this world, To be able to give birth to extraordinary power, one had to involve the rules of heaven and earth, the nature of the matter, and the almost perfect heaven and earth within the matter. This was just like the extraordinary cultivation method that could be cultivated in ordinary heaven and earth. It definitely required an extremely deep understanding of the heaven and earth itself, as well as a deep understanding of the power in order to be able to be created. For the living beings in this world, they were already used to the various mysteries of this world and the various appearances of this world. When they looked at the cultivation method of any extraordinary power, they could naturally only see the surface and could not see through the deep mysteries within. In contrast, Luo Fan was obviously completely different. His vision and his knowledge were all extremely high. No matter what cultivation method appeared in front of him, he would naturally instinctively see through the deep mysteries and see through the true essence behind the appearance. Chapter 2090. The caste demon continued to disintegrate in Luo Fan's eyes, and the various subtle mysteries within it continuously emerged. The best novel reading experience can be found in. Now, the changes that occurred to his dharmic power of laws were actually not really a change in the nature of his dharmic power of laws. It was just that some hidden changes in the Dharma power of law were triggered and activated because of the extraordinary power. In this way, it was naturally enough to have an extraordinary power. Luo Fan's current body was already perfectly integrated, and his Dharma power of law was closely connected to everything else. Since his Dharma power of law had undergone a transformation, everything else naturally began to transform as well. Not long after, he felt as if he had completely transcended the shackles, and everything about him was no longer restricted at all. With a slight movement of his heart, his perception began to sweep in all directions. In a trance, he had already completely included the space-time within a range of hundreds of millions of light-years into his perception. It's really vast. Looking at the boundless world, even Luo Fan couldn't help but exclaim. His current perception could sweep through every inch of the undefended space in the entire world in an instant. However, at this time, even though he had already stimulated his perception to the limit and the range of his perception had even reached thousands of large worlds, he still couldn't feel the end of this world. Within this range of his perception, he could only feel the incomparably vast world. It was impossible to measure the proportion of the area he had sensed in this entire world. Was it already 90%, 80%, 70%, 60%, 50%, 40%, 30%, or even less? It was just an area the size of an ant on a planet? This kind of situation had rarely occurred ever since he cultivated to the false saint stage. But now, the third level of the Tao Master's Road appeared directly in front of him without any difficulty. It was as if it was reminding him that his strength was far from enough, and his realm was far from enough. In such a large area, Luo Fan sensed billions of countries and forces. Among them, there was a powerful and unparalleled aura existing. Although most of them couldn't sense Luo Fan's perception sweeping over, many of them faintly sensed it. In fact, when Luo Fan's perception swept over, there were even 3 auras that reacted intensely. There was a vague sense of perception spreading from where they were and heading towards him. Chapter 2091. At the same time, an inexplicable feeling appeared in Luo Fan's heart. That was, he could leave the third level of the Tao Master's path at any time and step onto the higher level of the Tao Master's path if he wanted to. That was the extremely mysterious fourth level of the Tao Master's path. However, it was obvious that ascending to the fourth level was not very tempting for him. What he cared about was his own cultivation. Ascending to a higher level was just a choice he had to make for better cultivation. Now that the third level of the Tao Master's path still had so many secrets and he could still obtain so many benefits by cultivating here, why did he choose to ascend and leave so soon? With a slight jolt in his heart, he suppressed that feeling. With a flash, he had already disappeared from his house. When he reappeared, He had already arrived at the strangest place in this part of the world. This place was a place hundreds of millions of light years away from where he was before. At first glance, this place was just a small valley. However, through his senses, he clearly discovered that the number of worlds in this small valley was hundreds of millions of times more than the normal amount. In this part of the world, there were almost perfect worlds in any matter. But after all, different matters had different sizes and densities. With these different sizes and densities, the number of worlds contained in them was naturally different. In normal circumstances in this part of the world, the same world of the same size would have roughly the same number of worlds. This was also the normal situation, according to Luo Fan's understanding. But the valley in front of him was completely different. In this valley, the number of worlds exceeded the normal situation by hundreds of millions of times. That was spacetime. It had even surpassed the limits of matter and directly broke away from it. It squeezed the matter into a very, very small part and turned it into many stars, or in other words, impurities. If such a place did not have any secrets or mysteries, it would simply be an insult to Luo Fan's wisdom. He stood there quietly, his eyes indifferent. With a sweep of his eyes, he could sense everything within the valley. This place seemed to be a valley on the surface, but in fact, its interior was simply like a chaotic state. With a single glance, it was a boundlessly vast and boundless world. These worlds spread around the valley in an extremely complicated way, forming a subtle balance with the laws of the outside world and the spacetime of this world. This delicate balance was now incomparably calm. But it was predictable. Once this balance was broken, then the consequences would be earth-shattering. There were tens of thousands of auras around the valley. These auras, some of them had the aura of the Tao Master's disciples, while others were similar to an Yun. They were just rogue cultivators. Most of them were existences with the aura of the Tao Sovereign's disciples, however, although there were many of them, and their auras were quite powerful. In Luo Fan's eyes, they were nothing more than ants. After all, these existences were the strongest. They were nothing more than loose immortals. Of course, this was not their real realm, but the realm they had reached after regaining their extraordinary power on the third level of the road to Tao Master. With such a realm, the power they could unleash had already reached an unimaginable level. If any one of them were to fall into another realm, it would probably be enough to overturn the world. However, in Luo Fan's eyes, such existences did not even need to make a move. He only needed to glance at them to completely destroy them. With such confidence, one could imagine what these creatures would look like in his eyes. Since Luo Fan's power was no longer restricted by this realm, it was naturally impossible for him to be discovered by these cultivators. At this moment, he stood directly outside the valley, but none of the cultivators could detect his presence. They were all carefully observing the valley, as if they were waiting for some sort of change to occur in the valley. Luo Fan's heart stirred slightly. He lifted a step and took a light step forward, arriving beside the strongest cultivator among the tens of thousands of cultivators. The cultivator's realm was naturally an expert of the three tribulations, but in this realm, due to the restrictions of this realm, he could only unleash the power close to the realm of true immortals. The moment Luo Fan appeared, he had already completely lost control of his body because of Luo Fan's will. "What are you guys waiting for here?" Luo Fan asked directly at this time without hesitation. His words were light, but to the cultivator's ears, it was as if hundreds of millions of tons of weight was directly pressing on his heart, making it extremely difficult for him to breathe. At this moment, the cultivator already had an extremely intuitive understanding. I am no match for this expert in front of me. Even if I am not restricted and can unleash the realm of cultivation perfectly, I still can't change the result. With this understanding, an indescribable fear surged from the bottom of his heart. He opened his mouth and said, "I am a disciple of a Tao Master. May I know which Tao Master you are under, Senior?" Perhaps our relationship is closer than Senior thinks. Hearing this, Luo Fan faintly smiled and said, "Don't say anything else, just answer my question." As he spoke, an extremely powerful deterrent was generated around him and directly poured into the cultivator's eyes. At this moment, the cultivator felt his entire body tremble violently. An indescribable fear occupied his entire mind, causing all other thoughts to disappear in an instant. At this moment, he just kept nodding. Seeing this, Luo Fan nodded in satisfaction and said, "It seems that you already understand the current situation." As he spoke, he restrained his power and turned himself into an ordinary creature. Without any sound, he quietly stood in front of the disciple of a Tao master, looking at him quietly, waiting for him to recover. Although the time that the other party needed to recover seemed to be quite a waste, after all, he was not going to force this and give the other party some time to recover. It was not a big deal. Because of this thought, the disciple of a Tao master had more time to calm down. After a while, only then did he recover and said to Luo Fan, "Senior, I'll let you know that what we're waiting for here is the reconstruction of the Holy Devil Valley that happens once every 10,000 years. Every time it is reconstructed, there will be countless spiritual lights in the valley and countless treasures will gush out. As long as we can snatch even a little bit of it, we will be able to obtain an astonishing improvement." Every 10,000 years? Could it be that the time was almost up? "Is that why you are waiting here?" Luo Fan asked with a frown. Hearing this, the disciple of a Tao master hurriedly said, "That is not the case. In fact, there is still more than 3,000 years until the next reconstruction of the valley. We are waiting here just to prepare for a rainy day." "Tell me about it." Luo Fan was even more curious. "With our strength, if we wait until the time is almost up to come here, we will definitely not be able to squeeze into our current position. Therefore, we can only first occupy a good position here, then we will have the opportunity to obtain enough benefits. Although most of the reconstruction takes 10,000 years, there have been a few times in history that it has appeared randomly," the disciple of a Tao master said with a rather ashamed expression. When Luo Fan heard this, he already understood what the other party meant. These cultivators were impressively at the bottom of the many cultivators who wanted to fight for the mysteries released by the reconstruction of the valley. With their strength, they could not compete with other cultivators at all. They could only wait here first and occupy a good position, so when the time came, they would not be able to squeeze out of the other experts and not be able to snatch enough treasures. With this thought, he turned his thoughts, but in his heart, he was already suspicious. Among so many cultivators here, there were probably many sentries left by those experts. It was likely that there were many sentries left behind by the powerhouses. If there were any abnormalities, they would definitely be killed. Understanding this, they would immediately inform those experts. Even though he understood this, he only shook his head lightly. He immediately asked, "What treasures have you obtained in the past?" The cultivator trembled slightly. His expression was a little complicated, as if he was a little heartbroken, a little afraid, and even more so, as if he wanted to be ruthless. In the end, all these emotions turned into a kind of helplessness. Then, he raised his hand and with a wave, a piece of wood appeared in his hand. This piece of wood was as black as ink. As soon as it appeared, the surrounding light seemed to be attracted to it, causing the surroundings to become dim. At this moment, Luo Fan could not help but exclaim, "What a good treasure!" He casually grabbed the piece of black wood, which was about the size of a palm, into his hand. As soon as the wood was in his hand, he could feel the almost perfect world that was compressed into tens of billions of square meters. These worlds were intertwined together in an extremely subtle manner, forming a huge group of worlds that pressed the entire palm-sized wood until there was no gap left. It could be said that if the structure of these worlds was not subtle and profound enough, these worlds alone would have been enough to burst the entire wood, turning the wood into impurities between the worlds. just like the valley in front of him at this moment. Such a structure caused the weight of this piece of wood to be unimaginably huge. If it weren't for the fact that Luo Fan's own power was no longer restricted, perhaps he wouldn't have been able to pick up this piece of wood. You are indeed worthy of being the successor of a Tao master to be able to pick up this thing. Luo Fan smiled faintly and looked at the Tao master. The Tao master broke out in a cold sweat when he saw Luo Fan's gaze. He smiled embarrassedly and said, "It's just some body-strengthening cultivation method, it's actually nothing." Luo Fan was not in the mood to care about the Tao master's plan. At this time, he was only paying attention to the various interactions between the wood and the surrounding spacetime. He could also see that the surrounding laws were constantly generating all kinds of mysterious changes in the process, inexplicably exchanging with the spacetime inside the wood. Through this piece of wood, he could even feel the laws of the surroundings becoming clearer in his eyes. It was even to the extent that he could faintly sense the profundities of numerous profound laws and laws from within it. Originally, he just wanted to take a look at this piece of wood and then return it to the Tao master in front of him. However, after understanding the mystery contained in this wood, he directly gave up this idea and decided to directly take this wood for himself. At this moment, he held the wood. He said to the Tao master, "This wood is useful to me, so it's impossible to return it to you. What do you want?" As he said this, he just quietly looked at the Tao master, forcibly taking it. Of course, he could not do it and let the Tao master make a request for him. Obviously, this was his best choice. Hearing this, the Tao master felt a pain in his eyes. As for the fact that the log would leave him, he had already expected it. However, he did not expect the other party to be so direct, which made his reluctance to part even more intense. As for Luo Fan's request for him to make a request for an exchange, he did not care at all. After all, what was his identity? The Tao master passed it on again. For him, all his cultivation system and all his cultivation resources came from the Tao master. The root cause was the Tao master. Such an existence, what cultivation methods did he not have? What magic treasures did he not have? What magic powers did he not have? What resources did he not have? Given this, he could not think of anything that he needed that the other party could give him. At this moment, he said, "Forget it, since this thing is useful to you, I will give it to you. Don't mention anything about an exchange." Since he did not care about the other party's reward at all, and now that the situation was stronger than the other party, he was only at the level of an ant in the Tao master's eyes. If he still did not admit his inferiority, he would be courting death. When Luo Fan saw the Tao master pass it on again, he naturally knew what the other party was thinking. He only smiled faintly and said, "I'm not as good as you. How about I tell you how to break free from the shackles of this world and obtain the method to unleash all the power in this world?" His words caused the Tao master to be stunned for a moment before he almost jumped up. Transcend the shackles of this world. This was simply the common problem of many Tao masters in this world. It had been billions of years since ancient times, and countless Tao masters had cultivated here. But now, this world was still the same as before. Those who should be restricted were still restricted, and those who should be shackled were still shackled. This was enough to show how difficult it was to transcend the shackles of this world. This is impossible. It was a method that even the Tao master's disciples did not know. "How could you know?" Instinctively, he retorted. "All you have to do is answer. Do you want it or not?" Luo Fan asked indifferently. Naturally, he did not have the mood to argue with this Tao Venerable's disciple. Tao Venerable's disciples were not omnipotent. Just because they couldn't do it didn't mean that others couldn't. He was willing to pay the Tao Venerable's disciple just because he did not want to take it by force. If the Tao Venerable answered that he wanted it, he would naturally teach him the method. But if the Tao Venerable said that he did not want it, he would not force it. At this time, the Tao Venerable's expression kept changing. Suddenly, he gritted his teeth and said, "I want it." Hearing this, Luo Fan nodded and said, "You have made the right choice." At that moment, he didn't stop and pointed with his finger. A speck of spiritual light gushed out from his hand and poured into the body of the reincarnated Tao Sovereign. It began to tremble slightly as it swept through the body of the reincarnated Tao Sovereign. In the process, it began to undergo subtle changes, becoming a kind of appearance that seemed to be exactly the same, but also seemed to be completely opposite. It began to gather towards the Tao Venerable's heart. In the end, it turned into a kind of method that was completely different from the method that Luo Fan had used. This method was a little primer that Luo Fan had sent out, combined with the Tao Venerable's own cultivation path, and formed a method that he had mastered. This method did not involve Luo Fan's cultivation path, nor did it contain the mysteries of the world view. The real core, the real source, was only the Tao Venerable's own cultivation path. In other words, the method contained in the spiritual light that Luo Fan sent out was actually extremely imperfect. Only after it flowed into the Tao Venerable's body and circulated so many times did it naturally integrate with the Tao Venerable's own strength. In the end, it completely turned into this method, becoming the mysterious method that the Tao Venerable saw in his heart at this moment. At this moment, the Tao Venerable's originally disapproving thoughts had completely changed. His body began to tremble slightly. There was only such a thought in his heart. How could there be such an exquisite method in this world? This is definitely the method passed down by the Tao Venerable. There's no doubt about it, after all. He was the Tao Venerable's disciple, and his understanding of cultivation was far beyond that of ordinary rogue cultivators. With such a deep understanding, the moment he saw this method, he had already understood that this method was completely based on his cultivation path. It was a method that was far more exquisite than the extraordinary method that he was currently cultivating. He did not know whether cultivating this method could help him break through the shackles of this world, but this method was definitely enough to make up for the piece of wood that he had paid. Perhaps, cultivating this method really has the hope of breaking through the shackles. Then, such a thought that was originally impossible to appear in his heart appeared in his heart. Chapter 2092. With that thought, Tao Venerate Reincarnation's body began to tremble slightly. Immediately afterwards, he sat down cross-legged and closed his eyes, beginning to cultivate according to the method. This method was completely integrated with his own path of cultivation, and even combined with the concepts he had grasped to form a method. Naturally, when he cultivated it, it was extremely easy for him to get started. With just a slight thought, the power in his body trembled slightly, and countless strange runes appeared in his heart. They began to form a subtle and mysterious combination according to the description of the cultivation method, gradually turning into an indescribably complicated form. If an ordinary cultivator were to cultivate the intricacies of this method, even if they were at the same level as this cultivator, they would probably need millions of years to truly master it. However, for Tao Venerate Reincarnation, it seemed to be of the same lineage as his own path of cultivation. It was as if he had placed his left hand on his right hand, easily condensing this strange rune that was so complicated that it seemed like billions of worlds were stacked together. As this strange rune was formed, his body seemed to have suddenly turned into a black hole, and he began to crazily absorb the endless power in the surroundings into it. At the same time, the incomparably complex laws in the surroundings continuously gathered on his body and surged into it. Gradually, they fused with the complex rune that had just appeared in his body and produced all sorts of indescribable and mysterious changes. In the end, after countless trillions of changes, a wisp of transcendent power was born. The moment this wisp of transcendent power appeared, he felt an indescribable feeling of being able to do as he pleased. In fact, even the power that shackled him in this world seemed to have relaxed a little, at this moment, Tao Venerate Reincarnation understood that he had gained a great advantage. This method actually had a chance to allow him to transcend the shackles set by this world. For a moment, various scenes of him breaking through to the false saint stage and obtaining all of his power appeared in his heart, making him unable to help but feel excited. After all, although he was already on the third level of the Tao Venerate path and could unleash power that was countless times greater than that of ordinary living beings, but compared to all the power that he possessed, it was still insignificant. While he displayed these incomparably powerful powers in the eyes of ordinary cultivators, there was still an indescribable sense of grievance lingering in the bottom of his heart, making him unable to smile at all times. Under such a background, he was finally able to transcend and completely release all of his power. He was finally able to free himself from the shackles of this world. It went without saying how wonderful the feeling of being relieved of a heavy burden was. At this moment, he even felt like his body was trembling uncontrollably. With a thought, he suppressed all the distracting thoughts in his mind and operated the extraordinary power he had just gathered. With great difficulty, he began to convert the vast energy in his body, as well as his senses, his will, and everything else about him. After all, he was not an existence like Luo Fan who knew how and why. As for how this extraordinary power could allow him to transcend the shackles, he had no idea at all. He only knew that this kind of extraordinary power had such an effect. Under such circumstances, it was naturally impossible for him to be like Luo Fan. As long as there was a little bit of extraordinary power as a guide, everything in his body would naturally transform, and finally, he would be able to break all the shackles he had been holding. What he could do was to rely on this little bit of extraordinary power to transform everything in himself little by little. In the end, when all of his power, all of his perception, all of his will, and everything else were completely transformed, he would be able to break all the shackles he had been facing. Before that, he could only break a little shackles and exert a little bit of power every time he transformed a little bit of extraordinary power. Seeing that the aura of the Tao Venerate in front of him had changed greatly in just a dozen breaths, a faint smile appeared on Luo Fan's face, and he was quite satisfied in his heart. After all, the method he had just imparted to the Tao Venerate was just created by him on the spot. He was still not sure whether it was effective or how effective it was. Under such circumstances, he wouldn't be surprised at all if there were any problems. Fortunately, the worst-case scenario did not happen. The effect of the method was quite perfect. At this moment, he had only cultivated that method for a short period of time, but the Tao Venerate had already broken through so many shackles, and the power that it could exert had even reached the innate zenith heaven realm. One must know that in the past, the power that the Tao Lord's legacy could unleash was only at the level of someone who had just crossed over to the immortal state. According to the normal process of cultivation, with the cultivation speed of the Tao Venerate, it would take at least hundreds of millions of years to reach the current realm. Under such circumstances, no matter how you looked at it, the Tao Master should be satisfied even if he were to pass on his skills to him. At that moment, Luo Fan did not think too much about it. He picked up the palm-sized black wood in his hand and began to carefully sense the various mysteries of the black wood. The black wood itself had the ability to make the person who held it feel everything more deeply and clearly. Now, this ability actually did not disappear for the various internal structures of the black wood. As he held the black wood and sensed it, the mysteries of the various internal structures of the wood unfolded in front of him bit by bit. The mysterious and wonderful secrets were revealed bit by bit. In a trance, one world after another appeared in front of his eyes, magnifying and shrinking again. Every time he magnified and shrank, his inexplicable understanding of the wood began to increase a lot. Just like that, time slowly passed. For some reason, a long roar suddenly came from beside him. This long roar was so high-spirited and joyful that even the surrounding space-time was faintly affected. Even the surrounding laws seemed to have undergone some kind of change in this long roar. Luo Fan came back to his senses and looked over. He realized that the aura of the Tao Venerate was completely different from before. Now, his strength had already recovered to the false saint level. Although he had yet to reach his peak, and had yet to completely transcend the shackles of this world, he had already reached the goal of ascending and leaving this world. After roaring for a long time, the Tao Venerate stopped and landed. He bowed to Luo Fan and said, "Thank you, Senior, for fulfilling my wish. The benefits that Senior has given me are not something that can be made up for with that small piece. I have some memories that might be useful to Senior, so I hope that Senior will not decline." As he spoke, he raised his hand and tapped his forehead. With another pull, a bit of spiritual light was pulled out from his head and gathered in front of his finger. When Luo Fan saw this, he smiled slightly and did not decline. With a wave of his hand, that bit of spiritual light landed in his hand. With a slight movement of his heart, with a sweep, all the information contained in the spiritual light entered his heart without missing anything. Looking at this information, an inexplicable expression appeared on Luo Fan's face. He smiled and said, "Thank you." This information was nothing else but all the information that the Tao Venerate knew about the valley in front of him. It even involved many secrets of the third level of the Tao Venerate's path. Although Yun had given almost all of her memories to Luo Fan, he was just a rogue cultivator who could not even condense extraordinary power. Even if he had been on the third level for a long time, the information he knew was only at the bottom level. How could it compare to what the Tao Venerate knew? It could be said that although it did not involve all the secrets that the Tao Venerate knew, it was already more than 10 times more precious than all the information that he had obtained from Yun. It was precisely because of this that he thanked the Tao Venerate again. The Tao Venerate just said that it was just a token of his appreciation, and it was nothing. After that, he directly bid farewell to Luo Fan and turned around to leave the valley without any reluctance. Since he could already ascend and leave the third level of the Tao Venerate's path at any time, for the Tao Venerate, who else could restrain him? At this time, it was naturally impossible for him to keep an eye on the valley for others, and he had no interest in it. Under such circumstances, how could he stay here? Seeing him leave, Luo Fan just smiled slightly and began to carefully go through the many memories that he had obtained before. This successor of the Tao Sovereign had been guarding this valley for an extremely long time. He had seen the reconstruction of the valley, and the number of times it spat out treasures had been millions of times. With so many experiences, it could be said that even if he had not entered the valley, his understanding of the valley could be said to be thorough. At this time, these were all contained in the memories that he had given to Luo Fan. Unfortunately, his realm is still not enough. Otherwise, how could he not discover the true function of this treasure? Unexpectedly, Luo Fan sighed with emotion. He looked in the direction that the Tao Venerate had left, and there was a faint look of regret on his face. This black piece of wood was filled with heaven and earth that was far beyond the normal state, and the valley in front of him also contained heaven and earth that was far beyond the normal state. The structure of the two was so similar that no matter how he looked at it, there was an inexplicable relationship between them. Through his previous understanding of the structure of the wood and the various information about the valley recorded in the memories that the Tao Venerate had passed to him, Luo Fan finally grasped the connection between the two. This piece of wood was impressively a part of the hub of the valley. In other words, as long as he could obtain all the pieces of wood that were originally one with this piece of wood, he could completely control the valley. He could obtain everything in the valley. If he was confident in himself, he could even try to refine the hub with the structure of this piece of wood and then control the entire valley. This was the true mystery of this piece of wood. And after obtaining this piece of wood for so many years, The Tao Venerate could only guard this place and wait for the valley to be reconstructed every few years, waiting for the bits of residue that occasionally leaked out. This was simply holding a golden bowl and begging for money. It was an extreme waste of God's resources. However, of course, the Tao Venerate could not be blamed for this. After all, he was shackled by this world, and the power that he could exert was limited to an extremely low level. Naturally, his sensing ability was also at an extremely low level. It was only natural that he did not discover the secret that Luo Fan had comprehended for so long. Luo Fan's heart stirred slightly, and a wave of law power poured into the piece of wood in his hand. As his law power entered it, the piece of wood began to tremble slightly. Indistinctly, there was a mysterious ripple that began to spread in all directions. At the end of the wave, there seemed to be many indescribable things that resonated with the wave and responded to it. It's actually so far away, and there are so many of them. Sensing the number of existences that responded to the wave, Luo Fan could not help but frown. What he wanted to do by triggering the wave of wood was to search for the existence of the other parts of the hub. And obviously, those that responded to the wave just now were the targets he was looking for. What made him feel a little disappointed was that the number of these targets was just too many. It felt like there were at least hundreds of thousands of them. Moreover, they could not be separated from each other, and the furthest one was almost at the end of the range that he could sense. There were only 2 or 3 of them near this valley. How could this not give him a headache? After all, if there were targets at the end of the range that he could sense, it meant that there was a high chance that there were targets outside of the range. In other words, they were in places that he could not sense. This meant that if he really put in the effort to collect these fragments, he might fall into a bottomless pit. There might be 10 or even 100 times more fragments than the ones that responded to the wave of the wood. Seems like I can only use another method. With that thought in mind, Luo Fan could only sigh. Immediately, he stood up and walked toward the valley without hesitation. His power in this world was not restricted at all, and he could unleash his strength perfectly. Needless to say, his speed was extremely fast. In the blink of an eye, he had already stepped into the valley and entered the countless worlds within. Not many cultivators could sense this process. Even those cultivators who were staring at the valley only felt their perception flicker for a moment, as if something had flashed past their perception. They could not be sure if a living being had entered the valley. However, this did not mean that no one knew that someone had entered. In fact, due to this change, almost all the cultivators knew that some sort of existence had entered the valley. After all, regardless of whether the cultivators here were strong or weak, and regardless of how much power they could exert, their thoughts would definitely be extremely meticulous, and their trust in their own senses would definitely be extremely deep. Naturally, they would not think that their perception was an illusion. Since their perception had sensed something flashing past, regardless of whether they could confirm it or not, it definitely meant that something had really flashed past. Once they confirmed this, they would naturally understand what had rushed into the valley. Not to mention, even though these cultivators were competitors, they had been living together for so many years. After all, many cultivators would unknowingly establish a considerable friendship with each other. After exchanging their findings, they would naturally be able to confirm what they had sensed before. A fellow Taoist actually dared to enter. Could it be a newcomer? Some cultivators murmured in shock. It seems that there is nothing for us to do here. Let's disperse. A rogue cultivator said with a dispirited expression. From the looks of it, it was as if he had suffered a huge blow. Why are you discouraged? It's not like you don't know how terrifying this valley is. That person will not have a good time in there. Some cultivators could not bear to listen to him and frowned. How powerful must an existence that can make all of our perception unable to capture it be? Would such an existence really enter a dangerous place without any confidence? The dejected cultivator rolled his eyes and said, Hearing this, the expressions of the other cultivators changed slightly. Indeed, the stronger a cultivator was, the more cautious they would be. For things that they could not grasp or understand, the more they would be in awe. Under such awe, a cultivator would dare to enter a dangerous place. This meant that they had a deep understanding of the dangerous place and would only do it if they had absolute confidence. Just now, that cultivator was able to surpass their perception and directly enter the valley. This clearly meant that he had reached the level of an absolute powerhouse. In other words, such an existence was almost certain to be the kind of powerhouse that would not act without confidence. Another cultivator said dryly, "Perhaps he is one of the very few." Hearing this, the other cultivators only glanced over indifferently with indescribable contempt in their eyes. Chapter 2093. Luo Fan naturally did not pay attention to the various abnormal thoughts of the cultivators outside. At this moment, he had already entered a vast group of lands. In this place, the boundless sky and earth filled the void, flickering with all kinds of colors like the stars. However, what filled the world was not a void, but an endless amount of material fragments. It was like an endless amount of fragments of meteorite. The entire cluster of worlds was not static. Instead, it maintained an indescribable dynamic balance. Every world was constantly moving, and the movement of every world was closely related to the movement of every other world. Once it moved, all of them would move. The endless fragments of matter circulated endlessly between the lands in an indescribable way, faintly containing indescribable mysteries. They seemed to be closely related to the balance formed by the many lands, as if they were also part of the balance. At this moment, Luo Fan's position was on a certain piece of matter. This object was like a mountain, but it possessed a purity that was hard to come by in the third level of the Tao Sovereign's path. In other words, there was no part of the land within this piece of matter. This piece of matter itself was just a piece of matter. The characteristics of the matter itself were also the characteristics of the matter, and the power of the matter was also the power of the matter itself. This situation was extremely common in other lands, but here it was a miraculous sight that was almost impossible to encounter. As he stood on this mountain, as the mountain began to circulate between the lands, Luo Fan felt as if he had returned to the second level of the Tao Master's path, and had once again entered the eternal world. The countless lands were like the countless lands within the eternal world, and these meteorites were like the transportation network between the many lands. Why did you suddenly think of this? After a while, he smiled slightly and cut off these messy thoughts. At his level, one's own views were enough to affect everything he saw. Perhaps, in the eyes of others, the scene inside the valley was not like this. It might be more complicated, more mysterious, or even simpler. But in his eyes, the structure of the valley, the way the valley was assembled, and its appearance could only be like this. Here, there was no truth or falsehood, no right or wrong. Although the same thing would appear differently in different people's eyes, and it seemed that someone would definitely be wrong in this place, such a concept of right and wrong was no longer applicable. At their level, these almost completely contradictory things could already happen at the same time. After observing for a while, Luo Fan raised his hand and took out the piece of wood. Then, according to what he had learned from it, he began to manipulate the meteorite under his feet to slightly change its direction. Given the extremely delicate dynamic balance of this group of worlds, normally speaking, even changing the flow pattern of any meteorite could trigger an earth-shattering backlash, and then the existence that made the change would suffer an indescribable blow. But at this time, in Luo Fan's hands, this change did not cause any changes at all. The meteorite behaved as if it was in an ordinary universe. It was manipulated by him at will, changing the way it operated and changing its ultimate goal. During the entire process, the entire group of worlds was not affected at all, let alone any backlash. In the face of such a change, Luo Fan secretly felt relieved. Although he appeared very calm just now, in fact, he was not very confident. After all, the piece of wood in his hand was only one of the countless fragments of the hub. The information contained in it was only a 10,000th of the information contained in the real hub. Using this kind of information to manipulate this heaven and earth group and find the loophole of this heaven and earth group was obviously a huge risk. However, since the first step had been successful, he naturally had enough confidence in the next step. Under his control, this mountain-like meteorite began to push aside the obstruction of the surrounding meteorites, cut through the void, and headed somewhere in the center of this group of worlds. Naturally, this meteorite could not move in a straight line. Along the way, it seemed to be moving in an incomparably complicated maze. It constantly made turns here and there, and sometimes even had to go back a certain distance before advancing a certain distance again. Just like that, it took him several years before he finally arrived at his destination after traveling through an unknown number of worlds on the meteorite. It was an area that seemed no different from any other location. In this place, the distribution of meteorites was very normal, and there was nothing special about it. However, the moment Luo Fan arrived, the piece of wood in his hand began to tremble slightly, and an indescribable invisible light was gradually emitted from the wood. As the invisible light appeared, the area in front of him also began to emit invisible light, and it gradually intertwined with the light produced by the wood. As the two kinds of light intertwined, Luo Fan knew that he had found his location. In that instant, he activated his law power without hesitation and poured it into the piece of wood in his hand. Then, through the various comprehensions he had gained from the piece of wood, he began to manipulate the law power to undergo various indescribable changes. In the end, he went through a transition and entered an even vaster place. At this moment, an incomparably vast existence directly imprinted itself into his heart through his law power. In a trance, Luo Fan had a feeling that he had already fused with that incomparably vast existence, and could already control that existence. With this change, he raised his hand and grabbed at the void. The surrounding meteorites suddenly collapsed, and in an instant, they condensed into a huge palm that floated in front of him. As his palm changed, it began to constantly change. Every detail was perfectly simulated, even the expansion and contraction of the pores were perfectly imitated, and this change did not affect the perfect dynamic balance of the entire group of worlds. This situation was fundamentally different from when he manipulated the meteorite to move. Previously, when he manipulated the meteorite, he did not touch the dynamic balance of this group of worlds only because the change in the attitude of the meteorite coincided with the change in the dynamic balance. At that time, he seemed to be manipulating the meteorite casually, but in fact, he was still maintaining the dynamic balance at all times to avoid touching the entire dynamic balance. If not for this, why would he have made so many turns, circled, and advanced and retreated along the way? Wouldn't it be faster to just move in a straight line? But now, the changes in the palm that he manipulated the meteorite were completely different. Now, he no longer had any scruples about any changes in the dynamic balance of this world, nor did he care about the taboo of the dynamic balance. He just casually manipulated the meteorite to produce all kinds of changes, and under such circumstances, he still did not touch the dynamic balance, nor did he cause any chaos in this group of worlds. This was enough to show that he had truly manipulated a part of this group of worlds. At the very least, he had the ability to suppress the changes produced by this part of the group of worlds and spread to the entire group of worlds. After a bit of experimentation, Luo Fan knew that his original guess was correct. With a thought, he raised his hand and dissipated the palm. When he condensed it again, a continent appeared in this group of worlds. It was formed directly from the meteorite. This group of palaces was incomparably majestic and magnificent. On it, every stone, every piece of wood, and every carving contained endless mysteries and endless cultivation truths. There was also an indescribably powerful world view of the world hidden within. If the entire group of palaces were taken out, even a third or fourth tribulation powerhouse would probably be mesmerized by it. As soon as the group of palaces appeared, an indescribable ripple began to spread out naturally. It swept across an unknown distance and enveloped an unknown number of billions of square kilometers. In the end, it formed an outline that was vaguely similar to the piece of wood in his hand. If one carefully counted the number of worlds, they would find that the number of worlds was exactly the same as the number of worlds inside the piece of wood. Moreover, every world corresponded to each other, and there was no difference at all. After these fluctuations spread to this point, they began to stop spreading. Instead, they began to converge and gradually seep into those worlds. They continued to penetrate deep into those worlds and began to sweep through them from top to bottom. Gradually, an indescribable imprint was imprinted into those worlds. This process was not simple. Even with Luo Fan's help, it still took several hundred years to finally reach this goal. He imprinted his imprint onto all the worlds within that range, making him the ruler of all of them. As this change was completed, Luo Fan had an indescribable feeling. It was as if he had suddenly split into hundreds of millions of parts and turned into those hundreds of millions of worlds. All sorts of incomparably grand, subtle, and mysterious evolutions continuously appeared in his mind. As expected, this thought flashed through Luo Fan's mind as he pulled his mind out. At this moment, his eyes were incomparably deep. The depths of his eyes reflected the endless worlds, as if there were hundreds of trillions of stars continuously shining in the depths of his eyes, perfect heaven and earth. Every single one of them contained its own unique worldview. This kind of worldview was unique, and it was different from any other world, even if it was also a perfect world. Of course, although these near-perfect worlds were already near-perfect, they were still not truly perfect. What was lacking in this world was this unique view of the world. It was just like each of the hundreds of millions of worlds in front of him seemed to have a perfect and unique worldview at first glance. But in reality, as long as one grasped the existence of a worldview and carefully studied it, they would find that these worldviews were actually mechanical and rigid. Every worldview seemed to be formed from the accumulation and combination of pure ideas. It was not like the cognition of some living being, but more like the product of an assembly line. It was precisely because of this flaw that these countless worlds were only near-perfect worlds, but not truly perfect. However, this was a good thing for Luo Fan. If it was truly a perfect world, the worldview within would definitely be incomparably perfect, surpassing the limits of what he could comprehend and understand. Even if such a perfect world was placed directly in front of him, he would not be able to comprehend its mysteries. He would not be able to understand the principles contained within. That would be equivalent to having no value at all. In contrast, this imperfect worldview in front of him had loopholes and various flaws, but it was already enough for him to focus on. It allowed him to finally comprehend it and absorb as much of its mysteries as possible. Of course, this kind of situation would be meaningless in other places under normal circumstances. After all, this kind of worldview was too mechanical and rigid. To comprehend such a worldview alone, one had to break through the outer shell of the worldview, find the key to it, sort out the order of comprehension, and eliminate the concepts that were useless to oneself. The amount of effort and practice consumed was completely disproportionate to the gains. It was not as efficient as taking the initiative to perfect one's own worldview. Therefore, all along, although he knew that these near-perfect worlds were extremely beneficial to his comprehension of the worldview, he had never worked hard in this aspect. But this time, the situation was completely different. After completely grasping who knows how many billions of worlds in this area, all the obstructive effects of these worlds on him had disappeared, and all the mysteries of the world had been opened to him without reservation. Under such circumstances, he did not need to break the outer shell of the worldview at all, nor did he need to find the key, nor did he need to sort out the order of comprehension. He only needed to eliminate the ideas that were useless to him, and the efficiency had already increased by who knows how many times compared to before. This finally made the cultivation method that he had originally envisioned finally meaningful. It was no longer just a cultivation conjecture where the gains did not make up for the losses. At this moment, there was only an inexplicable expression on Luo Fan's face. There was an inexplicable joy on his face. His heart moved slightly, and the scene in front of him changed drastically. All matter had completely disappeared, and the entire world had lost its original form, turning into a bunch of scattered, condensed, disorderly, or slow and orderly balls of lines that were spread out in this area that seemed like a wooden block outline. These balls of lines were none other than the incomplete worldview. Clearly, he had just used his special authority in this area and his own thoughts to directly fade away all appearances, completely revealing the essence of these worlds, a little too little. Looking at these countless worldviews, Luo Fan finally sighed in the end. Although the number of worldviews in front of him at this moment was at least counted in the hundreds of millions. But among so many worldviews, most of them belonged to the disorderly worldview that was meaningless to him. Only a very, very small number of worldviews could barely be considered complete, orderly, and could still exist in this special environment. In other words, worldviews that were useful to him with such a number, if there were no other larger areas around him, he might be satisfied. But now there were tens of thousands of similar areas around him waiting for him to develop, so how could he be satisfied with such a number? Naturally, he would feel that these worldviews were too little. Then let's begin. With this thought in mind, he looked around in the blink of an eye. His perception penetrated through this area, and directly went out of this area, to the wider group of worlds. Compared to this area that had completely turned into a form of worldview in his eyes, the worlds in the surrounding areas were completely the same as before. They looked no different from before. At this moment, with a thought, he lifted his foot and took a light step, arriving at the edge of an area. Here, behind him was the endless worldview, and in front of him was the endless group of worlds. Looking at the endless group of worlds in front of him, the countless worldviews that were reflected in his mind began to change slightly, and the originally gentle way of circulation suddenly sped up by God knows how many billions of times. In just a few breaths, the circulation process that would have taken tens of thousands of years to complete was completed in his mind. Through understanding this circulation process, he very quickly grasped a certain key that he wanted. With a thought, he raised his hand and pointed at a certain area in front of him. An inexplicable wave was released from a certain area behind him, and it headed towards that area. In an instant, it had already enveloped that area. At this moment, that area shook slightly, and a force was about to counterattack and mince this wave. Suddenly, that wave changed slightly under Luo Fan's control, and it instantly turned into millions of special structures, instantly merging with that area. In the blink of an eye, all the counterattack force released by that area had been completely eliminated, and it had also integrated the brand that belonged to Luo Fan. Chapter 2094. In just the blink of an eye, the imprint that Luo Fan had placed in this world had already passed through the inexplicable connection between the world itself and other worlds into those worlds. In just a short moment, it had already placed Luo Fan's imprint on those worlds, causing those worlds to instantly transform into the appearance of the world in his eyes. Then, the worlds that had just been placed with the imprint began to become the source of the fluctuations, releasing the fluctuations and transferring the imprint in this manner. It was like a rolling snowball, causing more and more heaven and earth to be branded with Luo Fan's mark. The entire process did not even require any movement from Luo Fan, nor did it involve any of his energy. In just a few short breaths, thousands of worlds were already under his control. In just a few more breaths, there were hundreds of thousands of worlds. Just like this, his speed was constantly increasing. There were trillions of worlds in this group of worlds. If he used the normal method to refine a world, even if it only took an instant, it would probably take hundreds of millions of years. Obviously, how could Luo Fan waste hundreds of millions of years to refine all the worlds in this valley? Therefore, he chose this method. He borrowed the connection between the worlds to transfer his imprint, and borrowed the power of those worlds to fuse his imprint with the world. In this way, not only could his speed be guaranteed, but he might even be able to complete the entire refining process in a few hundred years. Moreover, he could also do his own things and begin to comprehend the many world views. Looks like this method is feasible. A thought flashed through Luo Fan's mind. Then, he lifted his foot without any hesitation and took a step forward. In the blink of an eye, he had already arrived in another direction of the area that he controlled. He felt that there was some intrinsic difference between this place and the previous area, as if they belonged to two completely different areas. In this situation, he naturally understood that if the hub existed, the control hub of this area would most likely be different from the control hub of the previous area. In other words, the connection between each world here and the world in that region was far inferior to the connection between the worlds in that region. If he didn't do anything about it, when the world's infection reached here, the entire process would be stuck. In the end, I still have to take action. Sighing, he once again took action. He stimulated the power of the world in the area he already controlled, releasing all kinds of subtle and mysterious fluctuations that instantly enveloped a certain part of the world in front of him. He began to break through the barrier of the world, and after going through countless fluctuations and changes, he found a flaw in the world and poured his brand directly into it, turning that part of the world into the source of the fluctuations in this area, and began to repeat the changes in that part of the world before. After doing this, he changed his direction again. Before heading to another area, he repeated what he had done here and activated a new source of fluctuations. Just like that, he shifted thousands of directions and activated conduction transformations in thousands of areas that were connected to the area he was refining, allowing those areas to voluntarily enter his embrace. This was not in this valley, or rather, all of the areas in this group of world. In fact, this was only the number of areas that were connected to the area he had refined first. The remaining areas were probably tens or even hundreds of times more than these thousands of areas. However, these areas had not been completely refined yet, and the remaining areas were not connected to the area he had refined, so he had no way to refine them efficiently. Obviously, he could only wait for these areas to be completely refined, and wait for the contact surface to expand. However, this was only a matter of time. For him, it was no longer difficult. Therefore, he was rather relaxed at this time. His perception leisurely spread out, enveloping the many worlds in the area he had refined, and began to distinguish the value of those worlds and comprehend the mysteries within them. These worlds were formed by various ideas combined together in an almost random manner. In itself, it was a miracle that such a way of existence could form a complete world view, but here, in this strange place, such a world view was not just a single one, but endless, calculated in billions and trillions. The charm of this was obviously worth pondering. This doubt had appeared in Luo Fan's mind not long after he began to comprehend. What exactly makes a world view take shape? He believed that as long as he grasped this key, his understanding of the world view would take a big step forward. In this instant, his thoughts changed. It was unknown how many diagrams, how many runes, how many profound lines, and how many ideas that were difficult to describe with words appeared in his mind, and they started to change and reform without end. They gave birth to all sorts of profundities that were millions of times more complicated, and they stimulated his mind and stimulated his will. Following this change, specks of light gradually appeared on the surface of his body. These specks of light were part of the world view of laws. They should have appeared and disappeared together with the world view of laws, but at this time, they appeared separately and appeared on the surface of his body. After it appeared, it continued to move and change, leaving behind millions upon millions of mysterious trajectories on his body. Luo Fan sat cross-legged in the midst of the countless world views, and all the changes in his mind were reflected in the outside world. Every moment, the endless world views around him would undergo all kinds of subtle changes under the changes in his mind. Some world views even disintegrated, condensed, distorted, and changed. They looked like they were being kneaded at will like plasticine. Every moment, he seemed to understand some characteristics of the worldview, and some key elements of the combination of concepts into the worldview. In this way, the specks of light shining on the surface of his body also underwent all kinds of subtle changes, as if they were undergoing an inexplicable adjustment. They seemed to become more and more rounded and refined in the process. Time passed, and 100 years passed in a flash. On this day, Luo Fan's heart trembled, and he suddenly felt an inexplicable change appear. His mind instantly broke away from the deep understanding of the world view. With a slight sense, he knew that the corruption and assimilation of the world had been completely stuck. He looked over, and sure enough, at this time, the process of the worldview continuously changing into the worldview had completely stopped. There were no longer any fluctuations that belonged to him spreading in the worldview. It seems that every part of the world in these areas is already under my control. Such a thought flashed in his mind, and he did not hesitate. Just like what he had thought before, he lifted his foot and took a light step forward, arriving at the edge of the area he controlled, and began to repeat the process from 100 years ago. He stimulated the power of the world in the area he controlled, and released all kinds of fluctuations to start invading the new world, turning the new world into a new source of infection, and starting another process of infection and assimilation. Because the scale of the area had increased by thousands of times, the number of areas he came into contact with had naturally increased by a lot. Although it was not thousands of times, there were still hundreds of times. After spending a few days walking around this area, Luo Fan had an understanding. In this case, one more time should be enough. The number of areas that could be divided into this mountain valley could not be unlimited. After expanding by hundreds of times, the number of areas that could be expanded by hundreds of times should be the limit. In fact, the number of areas that could be expanded by hundreds of times might not be full. It seems that in another 200 years or so, I should be able to completely refine all the worlds in the entire mountain valley. Thinking of this, Luo Fan could not help but feel a little expectant. He was really looking forward to what kind of changes would happen after refining all the worlds in the entire mountain valley. With a slight thought, he lifted his foot and took a light step forward. His figure returned to the area that he had refined for the first time, and he came to the group of palaces. Although he had already changed the appearance of the world in his eyes through his control of the group, and turned it into a world view. However, the group of palaces that he had built still existed. After all, if the group of palaces was also completely covered, then wouldn't it be useless for him to refine the group of palaces? Looking at the group of palaces, he raised his hand and grabbed at the air. An unknown force had already grabbed the entire group of palaces. Then, he suddenly pulled with all his might. Although the position of the palaces didn't change, the entire level started to rise. Originally, looking at the surroundings from above the group of palaces was not much different from looking at any other world. It was still limited by the distance and eyesight. However, as the level continued to rise, the large light that could be seen in the group of palaces began to change continuously. The various world views in the surrounding world began to shrink in the process, and the scenes that were reflected began to be constantly flattened. It was as if the group of palaces and the world were originally in the same painting, but now, with Luo Fan's improvement, the group of palaces gradually transcended the painting and began to overlook the painting from a higher angle. If one were to look at the painting from the inside, one would only be able to see a part of it. However, if one were to look at this painting from the outside, then the full picture of the painting would naturally be difficult to conceal. Therefore, at this moment, the many worlds and places in the group of palaces began to change. Originally, one could only see the surrounding worlds in the group of palaces, but as the level continued to rise, areas appeared like stars in the sky above the group of palaces. The areas that Luo Fan was refining were constantly being displayed in the starry sky. Every world and every view of the world was being displayed on the starry sky without missing a single detail. After doing this, Luo Fan's heart jolted slightly. He lifted his foot and took a step forward, arriving above the group of palaces. He raised his head and looked up. The area that he controlled was already completely reflected in his eyes. Nothing was left out of his sight. Throughout the entire process, he did not even use his senses to sense the entire area. He could already see everything that he needed to sense with his eyes alone. "It's a lot easier to comprehend like this," he murmured. With a wave of his hand, the group of palaces naturally changed. In the blink of an eye, he had already appeared on a platform. The surrounding palaces corresponded to a certain star in the sky. Vaguely, they formed a shape that was somewhat similar to the piece of wood he had obtained. Under these shapes, the many stars in the sky began to flicker one by one. Various subtle powers began to gather and fuse into the group of palaces under his feet. Gradually, the group of palaces began to operate. "Looks like there's still some kind of secret hidden here." Looking at this change, such a thought flashed across Luo Fan's mind. However, this thought only flashed across his mind for a moment. Right now, he had only refined a few thousand of these worlds. Compared to the entire group of heavens and earth, it was only an insignificant small portion. Even if there were any secrets, it was difficult to see through them now. In the end, it would only be a waste of his time. In comparison, it was better to put this aside and carefully comprehend the many worldviews and the various mysteries of the world. Once he completely refined the entire group of heavens and earth in the future, the secrets here would naturally appear. Wasn't that a better choice? Afterwards, Luo Fan entered the same state that he had been in for the past 100 years. However, compared to before, because of this group of heavens and earth, he was able to spare more energy to comprehend. His rate of improvement was slightly faster than before. His understanding of the world continued to deepen and strengthen as time went by. His own cultivation realm also began to squirm bit by bit. There was an extremely slow increase, appearing above his cultivation realm. Just like that, time passed quickly, and another 100 years passed. This time, without waiting for that inexplicable feeling to appear, Luo Fan had already taken the initiative to wake up from that cultivation state. At this moment, the specks of light on his body seemed to have turned into an armor of light that enveloped his body. Of course, this was not because the specks of light had spread to completely envelop his body. Instead, the speed and trajectory of the specks of light had become so profound that they connected together. In the end, it was as if they had turned into an armor of light that completely enveloped his body. Then, he looked up and discovered that the originally extremely dense starry sky had now turned into a complicated state that ordinary cultivators would faint if they raised their heads. The number of stars in the sky had increased by hundreds of times compared to before. Moreover, the complexity of the changes had also increased by hundreds of times. Among them, the trajectory of every star seemed to have an extremely close and crucial connection with all the other stars. Under such circumstances, even if there were only a few thousand stars, it was enough to shock people. What's more, the number of stars was already in the trillions, so one could only clearly calculate it. The shock it gave everyone was obvious how terrifying it was. It was not an exaggeration to say that people would faint. At this moment, faced with such a change, Luo Fan could not help but feel an inexplicable shock in his heart. "There's actually such a change after the scale increases?" he muttered. At this moment, as if it had been agreed upon, the stars that continuously appeared at the edge of the starry sky stopped. The entire starry sky seemed to have suddenly stabilized and finally stopped changing. This situation was clearly the same as before. The wave of energy spread on its own, and the process of infection had stopped. Seeing the situation that he had expected to happen, Luo Fan returned to his senses. He did not leave the platform. He raised his hand and pointed. In an instant, almost every star in the starry sky began to shine. The light continued to gather and jump. In the end, it seemed to form a large net that was directly scattered towards the dark area around the starry sky. As these large nets were cast into the dark area, spots of light began to appear in the area. As if they had lit up the starry sky, large swathes of light began to be infected by the specks of light. They constantly lit up and appeared, filling up the starry sky in front of them. In this situation, it was clear that Luo Fan was taking advantage of the special location of this palace complex and his special authority in this world group to remotely control this world group and begin to infect other areas. He began to continuously refine other areas and put them into his own system. The scene of the stars constantly infecting and igniting the starry sky was incomparably gorgeous. If a cultivator with a strong sense of aesthetics saw this, they might be able to create unimaginably powerful spells because of it. After 100 years of change, the group of palaces corresponded to the starry sky above them. At the very least, at this moment, the group of palaces had increased by several hundred times compared to before. Moreover, every palace in the group of palaces had undergone inexplicable changes. It seemed that countless mysterious mysteries had been added to them. Chapter 2095. In the blink of an eye, the imprint that Luo Fan had placed in this world had already been transmitted into those worlds through the inexplicable connection between the world itself and the other world. In just a short moment, it had already placed Luo Fan's imprint on those worlds, causing them to instantly transform into worldviews in his eyes. Then, the worlds that had just been imprinted with the imprint began to become the source of the fluctuations, releasing fluctuations and transmitting the imprint. Just like this, it was like a rolling snowball, causing more and more worlds to be imprinted with Luo Fan's imprint. The entire process didn't even require Luo Fan to move at all, nor did it involve any of his energy. In just a few breaths, thousands of worlds were already under his control. In another few breaths, there were hundreds of thousands of worlds. Just like this, his speed was constantly increasing. There were trillions of worlds in this group of worlds. If he used the normal method to refine a world, even if it only took an instant, it would probably take hundreds of millions of years. Obviously, how could Luo Fan waste hundreds of millions of years to refine all the worlds in this valley? Therefore, he chose this method. He borrowed the connection between the worlds to transmit his imprint, and borrowed the power of those worlds to fuse his imprint with the world. In this way, not only could his speed be guaranteed, but he might even be able to complete the entire refining process in a few hundred years. Moreover, he could also do his own things and begin to comprehend the many worldviews. Looks like this method is feasible. A thought flashed across Luo Fan's mind. Then, he lifted his foot without any hesitation and took a step forward. In the blink of an eye, he had already arrived in another direction of the area he controlled. He felt that this place was somewhat different from the previous area, as if it belonged to two completely different areas. In this case, he naturally understood that if the hub existed, the control hub in this area would most likely be different from the control hub in the previous area. In other words, the connection between every world here and the world in that region was far inferior to the connection between the worlds in that region. If he didn't do anything about it, the entire process would be stuck when the heaven and earth infection reached here. In the end, I still have to take action. Sighing, he once again took action. He stimulated the power of the world in the area he already controlled, releasing all kinds of subtle and mysterious fluctuations that instantly enveloped a certain part of the world in the area in front of him. He began to break through the barrier of the world, and after going through countless fluctuations and changes, he found a flaw in the world and poured his brand directly into it, turning that part of the world into the source of the fluctuations in this area, and began to repeat the changes in that part of the world from before. After doing this, he changed his direction again. Before heading to another area, he repeated what he had done here and opened up a new source of fluctuations. Just like that, he shifted thousands of directions and activated conduction transformations in thousands of areas that were connected to the area he was refining, allowing those areas to voluntarily enter his embrace. This was not within this valley, or rather, all of the areas within this group of world. In fact, this was only the number of areas that were connected to the area he had first refined. The remaining areas were probably tens or even hundreds of times more than these thousands of areas. However, these areas had not been completely refined yet, and the remaining areas were not connected to the area he had refined, so he had no way to refine them efficiently. Obviously, he could only wait for these areas to be completely refined, and wait for the contact surface to expand. However, this was only a matter of time. For him, it was no longer difficult. Therefore, he was rather relaxed at this time. His senses leisurely spread out, enveloping the many worlds in the area he had refined, and began to distinguish the value of those worlds and comprehend the mysteries within them. These worlds were formed by various ideas combined together in an almost random manner. In itself, it was a miracle that such a way of existence could form a complete world view, but here, in this wonderful place, such a world view was not just a single one, but endless, calculated in billions and trillions. The charm of this was obviously worth pondering. What exactly makes a world view take shape? This doubt had appeared in Luo Fan's mind not long after he began to comprehend it. He believed that as long as he grasped this key, his understanding of the world view would take a big step forward. In this instant, his thoughts changed. It was unknown how many diagrams, how many runes, how many profound lines, and how many concepts that were difficult to describe with words appeared in his heart. They started to change and reform without end, and they gave birth to all sorts of profound mysteries that were millions of times more complicated. They stimulated his mind and stimulated his will. Following this change, specks of light gradually appeared on the surface of his body. These specks of light were part of the world view of laws. They should have appeared and disappeared with the world view of laws, but at this time, they appeared separately and appeared on the surface of his body. After it appeared, it continued to move and change, leaving behind millions upon millions of mysterious trajectories on his body. Luo Fan sat cross-legged in the midst of the countless world views, and all the changes in his mind were reflected in the outside world. Every moment, the endless world views around him would undergo all kinds of subtle changes under the changes in his mind. Some world views even disintegrated, condensed, distorted, and changed. They looked like they were being kneaded at will like plasticine. Every moment, he seemed to understand some characteristics of the worldview, and some key elements of the combination of concepts into the worldview. In this way, the specks of light shining on the surface of his body also underwent all kinds of subtle changes, as if they were undergoing an inexplicable adjustment. They seemed to become more and more rounded and refined in the process. Time passed, and 100 years passed in a flash. On this day, Luo Fan's heart trembled, and he suddenly felt an inexplicable change appear. His mind instantly broke away from the deep understanding of the world view. With a slight sense, he knew that the corruption and assimilation of the world had been completely stuck. He looked over, and sure enough, at this time, the process of the world view continuously changing into the world view had completely stopped, and there were no longer any fluctuations that belonged to him spreading in the world view. It seems that every part of the world in these areas is already under my control. With this thought flashing in his mind, he did not hesitate, and according to what he had thought before, he lifted his foot and took a light step, arriving at the edge of the area he controlled, and began to repeat the process from 100 years ago. He stimulated the power of the world in the area he controlled, and released all kinds of fluctuations to start invading the new world, turning the new world into a new source of infection, and starting another process of infection and assimilation. Because the scale of the area had already increased by thousands of times, the number of areas he came into contact with had naturally increased by a lot. Although it was not thousands of times, there were still hundreds of times. After spending a few days walking around this area, Luo Fan had an understanding. In this case, one more time should be enough. The number of areas that could be divided into this mountain valley could not be unlimited after all. After expanding by hundreds of times, the number of areas that could be expanded by hundreds of times should be the limit. Moreover, the number of areas that could be expanded by hundreds of times might not be full. It seems that in another 200 years or so, I should be able to completely refine all the worlds in the entire mountain valley. Thinking of this, Luo Fan could not help but feel a little expectant. He was really looking forward to what kind of changes would happen after refining all the worlds in the entire mountain valley. With a slight thought, he lifted his foot and took a light step, returning to the area where he had refined the first step, and arrived above the group of palaces. Although he had already changed the appearance of the world in his eyes through his control of the group, and turned it into a world view, the group of palaces that he had built still existed. After all, if the group of palaces was also completely covered, wouldn't it be useless for him to refine the group of palaces? Looking at the group of palaces, he raised his hand and grabbed at the air, and an unknown force had already grabbed the entire group of palaces. Looking at the group of palaces, he raised his hand and grabbed at the air, and an inexplicable force had already grabbed the entire group of palaces. Then, he suddenly pulled with force. Although the position of the group of palaces did not change, the entire level began to rise continuously. Originally, looking at the surroundings from above the group of palaces was not much different from looking at any other world. It was still limited by the distance and eyesight. However, as the level continued to rise, the large light that could be seen in the group of palaces began to change continuously. The various world views in the surrounding world began to shrink in the process, and the scenes that were reflected began to be constantly flattened. It was as if the group of palaces and the world were originally in the same painting, but now, with Luo Fan's improvement, the group of palaces gradually transcended the painting, and they began to be able to overlook the painting from a higher angle. If one were to look at the painting from the inside, one would only be able to see a part of it. However, if one were to look at this painting from the outside, then the full picture of the painting would naturally be difficult to conceal. Therefore, at this moment, the many worlds and places in the group of palaces began to change. Originally, one could only see the surrounding worlds in the group of palaces, but as the level continued to rise, areas appeared like stars in the sky above the group of palaces. The areas that Luo Fan was refining were constantly being displayed in the starry sky. Every world and every view of the world was being displayed on the starry sky without missing a single detail. After doing this, Luo Fan's heart jolted slightly. He lifted his foot and took a step forward, arriving above the group of palaces. He raised his head and looked up. The area that he controlled was already completely reflected in his eyes. Nothing was left out of his sight. Throughout the entire process, he did not even use his senses to sense the entire area. He could already see everything that he needed to sense with his eyes alone. "It's a lot easier to comprehend like this," he murmured. With a wave of his hand, the group of palaces naturally changed. In the blink of an eye, he had already appeared on a platform. The surrounding palaces corresponded to a certain star in the sky. Vaguely, they formed a shape that was somewhat similar to the piece of wood he had obtained. Under these shapes, the many stars in the sky began to flicker one by one. Various subtle powers began to gather and fuse into the group of palaces under his feet, gradually making the group of palaces begin to operate. "Looks like there's still some kind of secret hidden here," Looking at this change, such a thought flashed across Luo Fan's mind. However, this thought only flashed across his mind for a moment. Right now, he had only refined a few thousand of these worlds. Compared to the entire group of heavens and earth, it was only an insignificant small portion. Even if there were any secrets, it would be difficult to see through them now. In the end, it would only be a waste of his time. In comparison, it was better to put this aside and carefully comprehend the many worldviews and the various mysteries of the world. Once he completely refined the entire group of heavens and earth in the future, the secrets here would naturally appear. Wasn't that a better choice? Afterwards, Luo Fan entered the same state that he had been in for the past 100 years. However, compared to before, because of this group of heavens and earth, he was able to spare more energy to comprehend. His rate of improvement was slightly faster than before. His understanding of the world continued to deepen and strengthen as time went by. His own cultivation realm also began to squirm bit by bit. There was an extremely slow increase, appearing above his cultivation realm. Just like this, time passed quickly, and another 100 years passed. This time, without waiting for that inexplicable feeling to appear, Luo Fan had already taken the initiative to wake up from that cultivation state. At this moment, the specks of light on his body seemed to have turned into an armor of light that enveloped his body. Of course, this was not because the specks of light had already spread to completely envelop his body. Instead, the speed and trajectory of the specks of light had become so profound that they connected together. In the end, it was as if they had turned into an armor of light that completely enveloped his body. Then, he looked up and discovered that the originally extremely dense starry sky had now become a complicated state that ordinary cultivators would faint if they raised their heads. The number of stars in the sky had increased by hundreds of times compared to before. Moreover, the complexity of the changes had also increased by hundreds of times. Among them, the trajectory of every star seemed to have an extremely close and crucial connection with all the other stars. Under such circumstances, even if there were only a few thousand stars, it was enough to shock people. What's more, the number of stars was already in the trillions, so it was easy to imagine how terrifying the shock it gave everyone was. It was not an exaggeration to say that people would faint. At this moment, faced with such a change, Luo Fan could not help but feel an inexplicable shock in his heart. "There's actually such a change after the scale increases?" he muttered. At this moment, as if it had been agreed upon, the stars that continuously appeared at the edge of the starry sky stopped. The entire starry sky seemed to have suddenly stabilized and finally stopped changing. This situation was clearly the same as before. The wave of energy spread on its own, and the process of infection had stopped. Seeing the situation that he had expected to happen, Luo Fan returned to his senses. He did not leave the platform. He raised his hand and pointed. In an instant, almost every star in the starry sky began to shine brightly. The light continuously gathered and pulsed. In the end, it formed a large net and directly spread towards the dark area around the starry sky. As these large nets were cast into the dark area, spots of light began to appear in the area. It was as if the starry sky had been lit up. Large swathes of light began to be infected by the specks of light. They constantly lit up and appeared, filling up the starry sky in front of them. This situation was clearly the result of Luo Fan using the special location of this group of palaces and his special authority in this group of worlds to remotely control this group of worlds to infect the other areas. He began to refine the other areas and put them into his own system. The scene of the stars constantly infecting and igniting the starry sky was incomparably gorgeous. If a cultivator with a strong sense of aesthetics saw this, they might be able to create unimaginably powerful spells because of it. After 100 years of change, the group of palaces had also undergone tremendous changes. At the very least, at this moment, the group of palaces had grown hundreds of times larger than before. Moreover, every palace in the group of palaces had undergone inexplicable changes. It was as if countless mysterious mysteries had been added to them,